Imagine winter. Now imagine it never leaves. That's the Ice Age. It was basically Earth's emotional breakdown. Roughly 2.6 million years ago, Earth decided it was time for a dramatic makeover. And by makeover we mean slapping a frosty filter on the entire planet and refusing to turn the thermostat back up. The Pleistocene epoch, commonly known as the Ice Age, lasted until about 11,700 years ago. During that time, the world experienced cycles of glacial advances and retreats, kind of like your ex texting you at 2 a.m., then ghosting for 10,000 years. Hello travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To be clear, the Ice Age wasn't one long, uninterrupted snowpocalypse. It came in glacial cycles, long stretches of freezing cold glacials, punctuated by shorter, warmer interglacials. We're currently living in one of those warmer periods, which is why you're reading this in a heated room and not fending off frostbite with mammoth pelts. During the coldest peaks, particularly the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, massive glaciers up to 2 miles thick covered much of North America, Northern Europe and Asia. That's enough ice to bury the Empire State Building with room for a snowman on top. Sea levels dropped by over 100 meters, exposing entire land bridges like Beringia, which connected Siberia to Alaska, allowing early humans and animals to walk between continents like they were just popping over to a neighbor's ice kingdom. It wasn't just snow and icicles. This era reshaped the world map. Deserts became wetter, forests shrank or vanished, and fertile plains turned into frozen tundra. Surviving the Ice Age didn't just mean braving cold. It meant adapting to a landscape in emotional crisis, constantly shifting between "you're going to freeze" and "you're going to starve." The climate wasn't just cold, it was wildly unpredictable. There were sudden temperature swings, arid dust storms, and freezing winds that made every outdoor stroll feel like nature was punching you in the face with an icy mitten. Massive sheets of ice created their own wind patterns and local climates, while cold ocean currents warped precipitation patterns across the globe. For early humans, weather forecasting meant looking at the sky, shrugging, and hoping you didn't wake up buried in snow. Oh, and the summers. They barely counted. In some regions, summer lasted just a few weeks, enough time to pick some berries, fail to tan, and prepare for the next 9 months of nature's deep freeze. The Ice Age wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a multi-species stress test. The main players on the human side were Homo sapiens, aka us, showing up around 300,000 years ago in Africa, with a taste for tools and a flair for outliving everyone. Neanderthals, the brawnier, broad-nosed relatives in Europe and Western Asia, great at surviving the cold, not great at surviving extinction. Denisovans, the mysterious cousins mostly known from a finger bone in a Siberian cave, basically the introverts of the human family tree. These groups weren't living in cozy isolation. There was mixing, migrating, and the occasional awkward interbreeding moment. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens even shared a few passionate Ice Age Tinder nights, resulting in modern humans today carrying about 1 or 2% Neanderthal DNA. Proof that even during an extinction event, some people still made time for romance. So what caused this great global chill? It wasn't one thing. It was a perfect storm of orbital mechanics and feedback loops. Enter the Milankovitch cycles, a trio of Earth's natural movements that control how much sunlight we get. Eccentricity. Earth's orbit wobbles from circular to elliptical every 100,000 years. Axial tilt. Earth leans like a lazy snowman, changing its tilt every 41,000 years. Precession. Earth wobbles like a top every 26,000 years. When these cycles line up just right or just wrong, they reduce solar radiation, cool the planet, and kick off glacial growth. Throw in volcanic activity and ocean current shifts, and you've got yourself one heck of a planetary cold spell. It's worth noting that Earth didn't become cold all at once. It tiptoed into glaciation like it was testing the water in a very large, very unpleasant pool. The Ice Age wasn't some romantic fur-lined wilderness. It was a test of endurance on a spinning snowball. Food was scarce, the air was dry, the wind hurt your face, and most of your neighbors were either predators or already extinct. And yet, Some early humans didn't just survive. They adapted, innovated, and eventually thrived. But don't get cocky. We haven't even covered how they stayed warm, found food, or didn't freeze to death in their own huts. That's coming up next. In summary, surviving the Ice Age was like living inside a freezer full of wolves, and you were the popsicle, before central heating, insulation, or even 4 walls and a roof. Early humans faced a daily architectural challenge: how not to freeze to death in your own sleep. It wasn't a matter of home decor or property value. Shelter was your first and last defense against an Ice Age climate that didn't care about your survival or your aesthetic. And yet, somehow, against the endless snowdrifts and the wind that slapped harder than nature intended, they made homes, real ones, not stick-a-hide over a log excuses. We're talking sturdy, functional, sometimes downright impressive structures built by prehistoric hands. Let's take a tour of Ice Age real estate. Bring your own mammoth fur throw. When you think caveman, your brain probably conjures up someone in a fur tunic grunting inside a stone cavern. And honestly, that's not wrong, at least some of the time. Caves were prime real estate, especially in Ice Age Europe and Central Asia. Why? Because caves came with built-in advantages. They were already there, no building required. Stable temperatures, they stayed relatively cool in summer and less freezing in winter. Natural protection, thick stone walls kept out predators, wind and nosy neighbors, like saber-toothed cats. But there were downsides too. Caves weren't scattered like Starbucks. They were scarce, especially in flatter regions. If you found one, chances are someone else was already squatting in it, possibly a bear with very strong opinions about roommates. In some places, humans had to share caves with animals or each other in a prehistoric version of cave timeshare. So while caves were cozy, they weren't the only option. In fact, most Ice Age humans didn't spend their lives inside caves. They built their own homes, and that's where things get seriously creative. Let's say you didn't find a cave. You're in the middle of a frozen plain with nothing but snow, bones, and bad decisions. Time to build. Enter the mammoth bone hut, the Ice Age's answer to dream home. These remarkable shelters have been uncovered at archaeological sites, like Mezherich in Ukraine, where early humans built circular homes from massive mammoth bones, tusks, and skulls. They arranged the bones like structural beams, then draped them with animal hides to keep the wind out. Floor insulation was often padded with grass, moss, or straw, and the interiors had designated hearths, sleeping areas, and even storage spaces. Yes, that's right, storage. Even in the Pleistocene, people had stuff they didn't want lying around. These mammoth mansions weren't tiny either. Some were up to 15 feet across, which is basically a prehistoric studio apartment, minus the Wi-Fi and roaches, but probably with wolves. And while mammoths weren't exactly building materials you picked up at the store, if you and your crew managed to bring one down, you had both dinner and drywall in one go. Other groups, especially in forested regions, built homes from wooden frames covered in hide or bark. Think of them as high-efficiency yurts, rounded structures designed to deflect wind, trap heat, and shelter entire families, plus their fire pits. Surprisingly, snow was an ally when it came to Ice Age architecture. Some human groups, especially in the far north, built semi-subterranean homes. They dug into the earth to create a recessed living area, then used sod, snow, and bones to create a roof. Why go underground? Because the earth stays warmer than the air above. Even in sub-zero temperatures, just a few feet below ground can make the difference between hypothermia and slightly uncomfortable napping. These dugouts were basically prehistoric insulation pods, combining dirt, snow, and strategic layering to trap heat like a reverse thermos. Snow could also be packed around shelters to create windbreaks, natural snow walls that reduced exposure to icy gusts. Add fur-lined interior walls, and suddenly you're glamping Ice Age style. Humans aren't built for cold. We're squishy, hairless, and prone to complaining when the thermostat dips below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So Ice Age survival wasn't just about building a shelter, it was about engineering it for warmth. That's where insulation tricks came in. Moss and dry grasses were stuffed into roof cracks and wall gaps. Animal hides weren't just for clothing. They were nailed, tied, or weighted down across walls and entrances to trap heat. Some groups used fur partitions inside huts to create warmer sleeping chambers. Basically, the first bedrooms. Even mud and dung were used to patch holes. Yes, it's gross, But when you're freezing, sanitary is less important than not dead. Though we'll save fire building for another chapter. It's worth noting, every shelter had a central hearth. That fire was the heart of the home, used for cooking, light, warmth, and social bonding. It was also a great excuse to sit down and not hunt anything for 5 minutes. So no, early humans weren't just roughing it, they were engineering shelter in one of the most hostile environments Earth has ever thrown at us. From mammoth bone frameworks to snowbank insulation, they used every scrap of the world around them to create not just protection, but something that resembled a home. Modern houses have drywall and thermostats. Ice Age homes had ribs, fur, and hope. And yet somehow, they were still warmer than your cousin's Airbnb yacht. When the wind is howling like a banshee, snow is falling sideways, and even your nose hairs have frozen into icicles, you don't just want clothes, you need them like your life depends on it. And for Ice Age humans, it absolutely did. Forget runways, catwalks, or seasonal collections. Prehistoric fashion was about not dying of exposure. Early humans weren't wearing animal skins to make a statement, unless that statement was, "Please don't let my kidneys freeze." Welcome to the origin of cold weather couture, where utility was everything, and the hottest trend was literally anything that trapped body heat. In a world without synthetic fibers, wool socks, or heated blankets, the ultimate resource for staying warm was the animal you just hunted. Every successful kill came with a bonus prize, a full-body outfit. Deer, reindeer, wolves, rabbits, foxes, bears, and especially mammoths were all fair game, literally. Once the meat was eaten and the bones put to use, their hides became survival's last line of defense. Furs were prized for insulation, especially thick winter coats that still held body heat. And this wasn't just draping a bloody skin over your shoulders like some kind of savage toga party. Ice Age humans processed the hides. They scraped off flesh and fat using stone or bone scrapers. They stretched the hides to dry, then softened them with brains or liver enzymes. A charming process known as brain tanning. Yes, you used the animal's brain to tan its skin. Early humans, the original zero-waste pioneers. The result? Flexible, warm, durable leather and fur, ready to be cut and shaped into clothing. There's a saying among traditional tanners, every animal has just enough brain to tan its own hide. That's both poetic and slightly horrifying. Once they had workable hides, humans had to turn them into something wearable. Enter bone needles and sinew thread. Let that sink in. Someone, thousands of years ago, picked up a piece of bone, sharpened it, poked a hole in it, and thought, I'm going to use this to invent clothing. That person deserves a standing ovation. Sinew, the tough tendon tissue stripped from animals, was twisted and dried into thread. It was strong, slightly elastic, and water-resistant. Basically the duct tape of the Ice Age. And with these tools, humans created fitted garments, tunics, leggings, parkas, mittens, and boots, all sewn by hand. No zippers, no Velcro, just the stubborn will to not be a meat popsicle. In colder regions like Ice Age Siberia or Alaska, this sewing skill evolved into an art form. Garments weren't just warm, they were tailored. Hoods, face flaps, cuffs, and drawstrings became essential features. You think layering is a modern trick? Ice Age humans had it down before Instagram influencers were posting #OOTD. They understood that air trapped between layers helps keep the body warm, so they wore an inner layer of soft leather or thin hide to wick moisture, a middle layer of fur or thicker leather for insulation, an outer shell of wind-blocking hide or water-resistant skin, like seal or caribou. Some even wore fur with the hair facing inwards to trap heat close to the body. Smart, right? It's like nature invented both the thermal layer and the puffer jacket, and humans just read the memo. Now let's talk toes, specifically how not to lose them to frostbite. Early human footwear was surprisingly advanced. Boots were constructed from layers of hide, fur, and soft grasses for padding. They were wrapped, tied, or sewn to fit snugly and keep snow out. Some shoes had fur lining inside, fur on the outside, and dried moss stuffed between for warmth. In some Arctic communities, rabbit fur was used for inner linings. Why? Because rabbit fur is dense, soft, and holds heat, like it's afraid to let go. It's also super insulating, even when damp, which in a world of snow and slush was kind of a big deal. The result? Primitive, but effective, footwear that let people trek across glaciers and tundras without their feet turning into icicles. Now, were Ice Age clothes stylish? Technically? Yes. Some early humans decorated their clothing with beads, carved bone toggles, fringes, and dyed patterns. Archaeological finds show signs of symbolic expression. Colourful, ochre-stained fabrics, geometric patterns, and even the use of feathers. This wasn't just fashion for fun. It may have signified status, tribal affiliation, or even spiritual beliefs. Because if you're going to survive in a fur parka for 9 months straight, you might as well look cool doing it. To the Ice Age human, clothing wasn't optional, it was armor. It was survival strategy. It was art, and it was innovation born from sheer necessity. So next time you complain about how itchy your wool sweater is, just remember, someone once wore a full-body elk outfit, stitched with tendons, while walking through a blizzard, barefoot, uphill, both ways. Modern winter wear is cute. Ice Age fashion was lethal. You didn't slay in those outfits. You avoided being slain. If Ice Age survival were a video game, fire would be the first unlockable power-up, and also the one you're absolutely not allowed to screw up. You could build the best mammoth bone hut, layer your deer leather couture, and hunt like a saber-toothed Gordon Ramsay, but without fire, you were done. Game over. Please respawn as a cave hyena's lunch, because during the Ice Age, fire wasn't just useful, it was life itself. First things first, fire didn't just fall out of the sky. Okay, sometimes it did. Thanks lightning, but counting on lightning to grill your dinner was not a viable survival strategy. Early humans had to learn how to make fire themselves, and they had to do it with whatever the frozen landscape begrudgingly coughed up. The two primary DIY methods were 1. The flint and pyrite combo, the OG spark plug. This method involved striking flint, a very sharp rock, against pyrite, a shiny iron-rich mineral. When struck together, they created sparks, tiny sizzling flashes of hope that could ignite a carefully prepared tinder bundle. What's tinder? It's not the app, it's the dry, flammable stuff, like shredded bark, dry grass, or fungi, especially amadou, from the tinder fungus, which early humans carried like ancient lighters. If lighters were flammable lint balls, this process required patience, practice, and the sheer willpower to not cry when the wind blew your spark out for the 12th time too. Friction fire, rub-a-dub, don't freeze. If you didn't have flint and pyrite, the fallback was friction, literally rubbing sticks together until the sheer force of your frustration created enough heat to ignite tinder. This technique included bow drills, a stick spun rapidly using a bowstring, and hand drills, just your hands, calluses, and 1,000 regrets. It worked, but it was hard. Like if you were alone, your best hope was to cry for help while rubbing sticks together hard. Once lit, fire became the beating heart of any Ice Age camp. It wasn't just a heat source, it was a life management system. Let's break it down. Warmth. The most obvious benefit. Fire raised the temperature in shelters enough to prevent hypothermia from doing what it does best. Winning. People huddled around it like moths in mittens, basking in its life, saving glow. Cooking raw mammoth meat is hard to digest. Cooked mammoth meat? Delicious. Fire made food safer, tastier, and easier to chew, which, if you've ever tried eating frozen root vegetables, is a pretty big deal. It also softened tough hides, boiled water, and generally turned dinner from a chewing contest into a meal. Light ever tried doing anything in the dark during the Ice Age? Spoiler, it doesn't end well. Fire extended the day, allowing for tool making, crafting, storytelling, and staring into the flames while contemplating why wolves keep circling the camp. Safety. Speaking of wolves, many Ice Age predators weren't fans of fire. The flickering light and smoke helped keep the fangs at bay. Fire was the original security system, and all it needed was some dry wood and a lot of paranoia. Here's the thing, making fire was hard. Keeping it alive, that was a full-time job. Losing the campfire wasn't just inconvenient, it was a disaster. That's why many groups appointed a person or rotated shifts to keep the fire burning, feeding it fuel through the night, like some prehistoric pyromaniac nanny. They even carried embers with them during migrations, nestled in bark, moss, or animal horn, carefully tended so it wouldn't go out mid-journey. It was like carrying a tiny baby dragon made of smoke, and if it died, you had to start from scratch. Again, some archaeological evidence suggests hearths were permanent features in homes, central pits ringed with stones, with soot-blackened ceilings above them. In some Ice Age dwellings, these hearths remained in use for years, their ashes becoming layers of survival history. Fire wasn't just a survival tool, it was a social anchor. People gathered around it to share stories, plan hunts, teach children, sing badly, and complain about how everything was frozen again. In many ways, fire helped build culture. It created a central meeting point, gave rise to rituals, and literally lit the way for language, cooperation, and community. If you lost your fire in the middle of winter, and you were far from flint, pyrite, or dry tinder, well, that was it. You didn't get a warning. You got hypothermia, and hypothermia doesn't negotiate. It just takes your fingers, then your toes, and eventually, your ability to be upright and human-shaped. So yes, if early humans had a single non-negotiable task, it was protect the fire at all costs. Without it, survival was just a countdown. The ability to make and control fire was, without exaggeration, one of the greatest evolutionary leaps in human history. It allowed our ancestors not just to endure the Ice Age, but to conquer it. Fire kept you alive, warm, and safe. Without it, you were just a cold snack in a fur coat. In the Ice Age, the grocery store didn't have a roof. It also didn't have aisles, cashiers, or any products that didn't run, stomp, or try to impale you first. If you wanted meat, you didn't scan it. You speared it, and what you were spearing was often the size of a bus, and had a bad attitude. Hunting was never optional. Meat wasn't just dinner, it was survival. It gave you protein, fat, bones for tools, hides for clothes, tendons for thread, and bragging rights for weeks. But here's the twist. Ice Age hunting wasn't an everyday activity. You couldn't just wander out and nab a mammoth, like it was waiting in a drive-thru. These were high-stakes, low-success rate operations that often ended with either a feast or a funeral. Let's start with the stars of the Ice Age safari menu. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant elk, musk oxen, wild horses, aurochs, and bison. These weren't your average woodland critters. Mammoths alone weighed up to 10 tons, stood 13 feet tall, and had tusks that could skewer a reckless hunter like a human kebab. And yet, humans went after them with sticks, sharpened sticks, occasionally fire-hardened, and later tipped with stone blades, but still, sticks. To call this bold would be underselling it. Hunting a mammoth was like trying to mug a freight train using a butter knife and a pep talk. But Ice Age humans were clever. If the direct approach was risky, they found ways to outwit their prey, using coordination, patience, and terrain to their advantage. Cooperative hunting was the name of the game. Hunting parties often worked in groups, sometimes dozens strong, using complex strategies to corral, confuse, or trap animals. Picture a group of early humans slowly encircling a herd of bison, waving torches, shouting, and gradually herding them toward a cliff. No, they weren't trying to start a stampede-themed musical number. They were aiming for the dramatic finish, a mass fall. These were known as buffalo jumps, and the result was both horrific and effective. Several tons of meat, instantly tenderized. Then there were the pitfall traps, deep holes dug along animal paths, camouflaged with branches and leaves, baited with tempting smells or leftover meat. An unsuspecting creature would walk right in, fall, and either get stuck or be finished off by waiting hunters with spears. It was messy, dangerous, and probably involved a lot of yelling. But when it worked, the reward could feed an entire band for weeks. There were also seasonal tactics. During migration periods, large animals followed the same predictable routes, allowing humans to set ambushes or funnel them into narrow terrain, natural choke points like ravines, riverbeds, or canyon passes. Once confined, the prey's options dwindled to two: run back into the hunters, or fall off something tall. Either way, somebody was eating well that night. But not everyone was chucking spears at woolly tanks. Ice Age hunting wasn't a solo sport, but it was a team one. And like any decent team, there was a division of labor. Adult males often led the high-risk hunts, while women, elders, and adolescents played vital roles, scouting herds, tracking footprints, processing meat, maintaining tools, and keeping the fires ready. Everyone had a job, and no, hanging back and hoping someone else got gored didn't count as contributing. Specialization eventually developed too. Some people were expert trackers, reading broken twigs and hoofprints like a novel. Others were skilled butchers, able to skin, gut, and portion an entire mammoth before the meat spoiled. And then there were the tool makers, the quiet heroes who kept everyone armed, sharp, and ready. The kill was only half the battle. Once an animal was down, the real work began. A single mammoth yielded an absurd amount of meat, fat, and bone. But if you didn't process and preserve it quickly, it would attract every scavenger in a 10-mile radius. Hyenas, wolves, cave lions, maybe even other humans with bad intentions and empty stomachs. So the butchering was fast, the cooking even faster, and preservation methods, like drying, smoking, or freezing in snowbanks, became critical parts of the post-hunt ritual. Feasting followed success, not just for nourishment, but for morale. After all, nothing bonds a community like not starving. Around the fire, meat in hand, stories were told of the hunt. Heroes were named, scars were shown off, and those who missed the throw were teased for years. Yinsnice aim, ugh. Next time maybe hit the mammoth, not the tree behind it. Of course, hunting didn't always go as planned. Sometimes the herd stampeded in the wrong direction. Sometimes the trap failed. Sometimes the hunters became the hunted. There's a reason archaeologists find human remains trampled into mammoth tracks. It wasn't all celebratory BBQs and bone jewelry. It was dangerous, exhausting, and terrifying. But it was also essential. In the end, hunting was survival distilled into motion. Cold air, pounding hearts, heavy footfalls in the snow, and the sharpened edge of desperation and ingenuity. Without it, early humans would have been little more than a short-lived curiosity in a very long fossil record. The good news, you found berries. The bad news, they bite back, and your tongue is now numb. While the mammoth spearers of Ice Age fame get all the action hero credit, the unsung champions of survival were those quietly stalking berries. Welcome to the other half of the human diet. Gathered, foraged, dug up, sniffed suspiciously, and sometimes accidentally poisonous. Because while hunting was dramatic, foraging was dependable. Less dangerous than chasing 10-ton ice beasts, but no less essential to staying alive when the nearest supermarket was about 30,000 years away. Despite the frigid conditions, the Ice Age world wasn't a total frozen wasteland. During warmer months, short-lived though they were, the landscape could burst into scrappy little patches of green life, and early humans, being observant survivalists with impressive digestive courage, learned to make the most of it. Their menu, let's just say it wasn't Michelin-starred, but it worked. Nuts, berries, roots, edible leaves, fungi, grasses, and tubers made up a surprisingly wide, if slightly fibrous spread of plant-based options. In warmer glacial zones and Ice Age interludes, especially near rivers or sheltered valleys, you'd find wild versions of everything, from onions and garlic to apples and hazelnuts. These weren't cute little handfuls of garnish, either. Roots like cattails and wild yams could grow big enough to make a solid meal, and if you were really lucky, you might even stumble across some wild honey. That's right, early humans invented dessert long before sugar existed. Of course, every delicious-looking plant came with a potential plot twist. Foraging wasn't a stroll through Whole Foods. It was a game of eat this or die. Some berries stained your fingers red and gave you energy. Others numbed your tongue and made you meet your ancestors early. So identifying safe foods became a generational science. Knowledge passed down by mothers, grandmothers, and surprisingly alert toddlers included what to eat, what to avoid, and what might be okay if you boiled it for 12 hours and said a small prayer. This is where the real MVPs stepped in. Women and children. While the guys were out dodging tusks and falling into pits, women and kids were the backbone of daily nutrition. Foraging wasn't a side hustle. It was a full-time job. Armed with baskets woven from reeds or bark strips, they scanned forests and plains for signs of food, broken nuts, half-eaten plants, tracks left by animals digging up tasty roots, and they were good at it. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies show that foraging, especially for plant foods, often provided the majority of daily calories. Not the flashy stuff, but the stuff that kept people going between feasts, famines, and the occasional mammoth roast. While hunting was high reward but high risk, foraging was steady, reliable, and repeatable. But, and this is a big but, there was a seasonal catch. Most edible plants only grew during the brief, temperamental summers, so early humans had to think like squirrels, gather now, survive later. This led to the rise of seasonal food storage, an art form in itself. Meat could be sun-dried, smoked over low fires, or frozen in ice pits. Roots were buried in cool, dry spots, wrapped in leaves or animal bladders to keep them fresh. Berries could be mashed and dried into fruit leather, which sounds delicious until you remember it was made without sugar, salt, or joy. Still, it kept scurvy at bay and gave people something to chew when the snow came back like an overdramatic X. Preservation wasn't just about extending the shelf life, it was about outlasting the void of winter. There were no second chances in February. If you didn't store enough in September, you got very skinny or very dead by March. Tools helped too. Early humans crafted digging sticks, sharpened at one end, to unearth tubers buried deep beneath frost-hardened soil. They used stone knives to cut fruit from thorny bushes and pestles to grind nuts or seeds into something marginally edible. Even animal stomachs became cooking pots, filled with wild grains and heated with hot stones dropped straight in. Practical, gross, and effective. Welcome to prehistoric cuisine. But it wasn't just about putting food in bellies. Foraging also provided medicinal plants, dyes, fiber for rope, and even early forms of chewing gum. Thanks, birch resin. People knew their ecosystems intimately. They didn't just walk through nature, they read it like a library. And yes, mistakes were made. Someone somewhere definitely thought those bright red berries were probably fine, and then proceeded to hallucinate colors that didn't exist yet. Others discovered that mushrooms come in two varieties, soup-worthy and death speed run. Trial and error wasn't just a scientific method, it was a dinner plan. But through persistence, observation, and a few very educational stomachaches, Ice Age humans carved out a sustainable system. Foraging balanced the diet, filled in the gaps, and gave communities the flexibility to survive, even when the hunt failed. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't involve heroic wrestling matches with woolly rhinos, but it was clever, efficient, and deeply rooted in human cooperation. If you couldn't make a spear, or a scraper, you were one icy tantrum away from being dinner. In the Ice Age, you didn't need a tech startup to become an innovator. All it took was a rock, a bone, and the overwhelming desire not to be trampled by something with tusks. Because when survival boiled down to who had sharper tools and fewer missing fingers, humans rose to the challenge with ingenuity that would have made MacGyver cry tears of admiration into his mammoth stew. Tools weren't just accessories, they were the only reason Homo sapiens could go toe-to-toe with the unforgiving climate, towering beasts, and a daily schedule that included phrases like "don't die before noon." And while animals evolved claws, teeth, and fur, humans said, "Nah, we'll invent things." Let's start with the classics. Stone tools. These weren't just rocks you angrily threw at passing wolves. They were carefully crafted, multifunctional survival gadgets. The all-star of the Ice Age toolbox was the hand axe, a palm-sized teardrop-shaped chunk of flint or chert that could do everything from slicing meat to chopping wood to making other tools. It was like carrying a bladed potato that meant business. Then came the scrapers, which, despite sounding like a medieval torture device, were essential for processing hides. You used them to remove flesh and fat from animal skins, turning gore into glorious fur coats and tents. Without a good scraper, your mammoth hide blanket would feel more like a crime scene than a comforter. But the true mark of a tool-wielding legend, that was the blade. Long, thin flakes of rock chipped down to razor edges. These weren't random shards. They were designed with surgical precision. With these, early humans could butcher animals cleanly, whittle sticks, and even perform impromptu haircuts, assuming someone invented hair guilt 30,000 years ago. And then there was the atlatl, the spear thrower, aka the most underappreciated weapon of the Ice Age. Picture a long stick with a notch at one end, used to launch spears with devastating speed and distance. It turned your average hunter into a prehistoric javelin champion. With an atlatl, you could hurl a spear twice as far, twice as fast, and look dramatically cooler while doing it. More importantly, it meant you didn't have to get within stomping distance of your prey. The atlatl was basically the original social distancing weapon. But it wasn't all rocks and pointy sticks. Humans being humans, they realized bones, antlers, and ivory weren't just for decoration or dramatic jewelry. These materials were tough, flexible, and surprisingly versatile, especially when you didn't have metal or plastic to fall back on. Bone needles, for instance, were revolutionary. Thin, polished slivers of bone with tiny, painstakingly drilled eyelets made sewing possible. And not just sewing, but precision tailoring. These weren't crude poke-and-pray tools. They were the difference between a cloak that kept you alive and one that exposed your left butt cheek to the blizzard gods. Bone awls punched holes in hides. Antler wedges helped split wood. Ivory pins held clothes together. If you could name a job, early humans had a tool for it. Or they'd invent one and pass it down like family recipes, only sharper. What's even more impressive is how these tools weren't made randomly. They were taught, shared, honed. The knowledge was passed from generation to generation like sacred lore, often through demonstration, imitation, and maybe the occasional sharp no, not like that. When someone tried to shave a flint core with their elbow, children learned to knap stone by watching elders chip away in rhythmic beats. It was more than craft, it was culture, and those who couldn't keep up, well, let's just say you didn't want to be the guy who didn't know how to sharpen a blade or make a spear point. In the Ice Age, being bad with tools didn't just cost you a job, it could cost you your ribcage. Communities needed everyone to contribute, and tool makers held serious clout. If you had a talent for turning sticks and bones into miracle devices, you were the medieval equivalent of a Silicon Valley engineer, only colder, hairier, and with fewer sandals. Of course, tools didn't stay the same. As groups migrated and adapted to new environments, their toolkits evolved. People living in tundra used broader, heavier points for hunting big game. Those in forests leaned on knives and traps. In coastal areas, you'd see specialized tools for fishing, carving bone harpoons, or cracking open shellfish. Adaptation was key. One-size-fits-all tools didn't exist. Local conditions demanded innovation, and innovation meant survival. What's perhaps most awe-inspiring is the creativity involved. Early humans weren't just copying what worked. They were constantly experimenting, sharpening stones at new angles, combining materials, turning sinew into binding cord into composite weapons. Failure was common, but failure meant learning, and learning meant progress. It's this technological spirit, the relentless tinkering, improving, and sharing, that laid the foundation for everything we use today. Your multi-tool pocket knife, your toolbox, all just the spiritual descendants of a flint scraper and a carved bone awl. The Ice Age wasn't a solo game. It was multiplayer, cooperative, and slightly bloody. If you ever find yourself waking up in an Ice Age tundra, shivering in your rabbit-lined boots, stomach rumbling, and wondering whether that howling in the distance is wind or something with very large teeth, you'd better hope someone else is nearby. Because in a world where even breakfast was trying to kill you, survival wasn't just about skill, strength, or smarts. It was about people. More specifically, enough people to poke a mammoth while someone else watches your back. The truth is, early humans were never lone wolves. They were pack animals with plans. We're talking small bands of 20 to 50 individuals, sometimes even fewer in colder regions where food was scarce and hugs were a heating system. These groups usually consisted of extended families, parents, children, grandparents, that one uncle who always told slightly inaccurate hunting stories, plus a few outsiders who wandered in, stayed for the mammoth stew, and just never left. This tight-knit setup wasn't just cozy, it was strategic. You needed a mix of age, ability, and attitude. Kids to pass knowledge to, elders to remember what happened the last time we tried chasing the elk into that ravine, hunters to feed everyone, gatherers to find roots, herbs, and emergency snacks, toolmakers, firekeepers, healers, babysitters, mammoth poop scoopers. Everyone had a role, even if some were less glamorous than others. And while it's tempting to imagine prehistoric society as chaotic grunts and club fights, reality paints a much more complex picture. These groups relied on a carefully balanced cocktail of cooperation, mutual trust, and knowing when to keep your opinions to yourself, especially when someone burned the last of the dried berries. Sharing was the social currency. When one person brought down a big kill, it wasn't theirs alone. It was everyone's. The meat was divided among the group, with portions likely going to families with kids, elders, or anyone nursing an injury from the last time someone yelled, "I've got this," and promptly didn't. This wasn't charity. It was survival insurance. because someday it'd be your turn to come home empty-handed, and you'd need that same generosity paid forward. And then there was the teaching. Knowledge didn't just drift into your skull through osmosis. It was handed down, one fire-lit lesson at a time. Children learn to recognize animal tracks, shape spear tips, and differentiate between the kind of mushroom that fills your belly and the kind that fills your lungs with regret. Elders told stories, part instruction, part entertainment, part subtle reminder not to be a complete idiot during winter. Storytelling, in fact, may have been one of humanity's most powerful Ice Age survival tools. Around the fire, people didn't just recount the day's events, they passed down generational wisdom, wrapped in metaphor and mammoth metaphysics. Once upon a time might have meant, don't ever walk near the frozen river at dawn, unless you want to meet a saber-toothed tiger and your maker. And speaking of tigers, let's talk safety in numbers. You alone? Your prey. You with 10 friends holding torches and yelling like lunatics? Now you're a force to be reckoned with. Groups offered protection from predators, not just through defense but through sheer intimidation. A hungry bear might think twice about attacking a group hurling rocks, fire and profanities in multiple dialects. But the benefits of the tribe didn't stop at the practical. Humans are social creatures, wired for connection, even when we're wrapped in furs and eating dried bison bits. Emotional bonds formed through shared hardships made it possible to endure the endless cold, the danger, and the fact that your shelter smelled vaguely like smoked squirrel at all times. We needed laughter, companionship, the psychological boost of someone saying, "Don't worry, we'll figure it out," even if no one had any idea what they were doing. Rituals and group identity played a big role too. While we can't know all the details, archaeological evidence suggests Ice Age humans buried their dead with care, painted symbols on cave walls, and possibly even danced around fires like ancient EDM fans. These weren't just cultural quirks, they were tools for unity, helping groups feel like something bigger than themselves. Because believing your band had a special connection to the spirits of the hunt might just give you the strength to go on one more freezing trek into the snow. Conflicts happened, of course. When food got tight or personalities clashed, groups split. Some individuals were exiled, but generally the consequences of being alone were harsh enough to keep people talking things out, or at least grunting them out over roasted pine nuts and strategic sulking. What we see from this is clear. Cooperation was humanity's superpower. Bigger muscles didn't save us, sharper teeth didn't help, but working together, figuring out how to share, teach, protect, and motivate each other. That's what let us face a world where winter never really left, and wolves were always watching. By now you might think the Ice Age was nothing but one long frosty episode of Survivor Pleistocene Edition. And to be fair, a lot of it was about not freezing to death, not starving, and not becoming saber-toothed tiger tapas. But here's the beautiful twist. Even in the middle of all that frozen chaos, early humans didn't just survive, they created. They decorated, they made music, they carved and painted, and buried their loved ones with care. In short, they invented culture, while their toes were still half frozen. Let's start with something surprisingly tender, for people whose daily routine included dodging woolly rhinos cave art. All across Ice Age Europe, especially in France and Spain, you can still find galleries older than history itself, tucked into limestone caves. The most famous, Chauvet and Lascaux, feature massive murals of bison, horses, lions, mammoths and deer. These weren't lazy doodles. These were detailed, vibrant and intentional works of art, drawn with charcoal, red ochre and manganese, using brushes, fingers and even blowing pigment through hollow bones like prehistoric airbrush guns. Why paint at all when survival was hard enough? That's the million-year-old question. Was it religious? Educational? Did someone just have a really deep love for bison? The answer's probably yes. All of it. These artworks may have been part of rituals, storytelling, early spirituality, or attempts to connect with the natural world and whatever unseen forces they believed guided it. But they didn't stop at walls. Portable art was a thing too. Engraved bones, carved ivory and figurines. The famous Venus figurines, for example, small statues of women with exaggerated features, have been found from France to Siberia. Scholars argue whether they were fertility symbols, goddess figures, Ice Age fashion catalogues, or something else entirely. But one thing's clear. Humans were expressing ideas, not just hunting dinner. And then there's music, which, let's be honest, nobody expected to exist this early. But it did. The world's oldest known musical instruments? Flutes carved from bird bones and mammoth tusks. One, found in Germany, is over 40,000 years old and still capable of playing notes that, if nothing else, would really impress a cave bear. Imagine sitting around the fire, wrapped in hides, chewing on some roast elk, and someone whips out a bone flute to set the mood. That's not just surviving, that's vibing. Music, like storytelling, probably served a bigger purpose than entertainment. It likely helped with social bonding, ritual, and rhythmically distracting people from how cold their knees were. Songs may have passed down knowledge, safe paths, dangerous animals. That one time Og fell into a pit, and we all laughed, but also learned something important. This brings us to rituals, because when people start decorating graves and painting cave walls, you can bet they're thinking beyond the here and now. Archaeologists have uncovered intentional burials dating back tens of thousands of years. People weren't just burying the dead to get rid of them. They were doing it with ceremony. Graves have been found lined with red ochre, surrounded by tools, beads, and in some cases, flowers. One burial in Russia held a child covered in thousands of ivory beads, taking someone months, possibly years, to make. That kind of effort doesn't happen by accident. It points to something deeper. Beliefs. Maybe not religion as we know it, but a sense that life had meaning beyond survival. That death wasn't the end, that the stars, the hunt, the fire, and the wind all had stories to tell and rules to follow. Maybe spirits lived in the caves. Maybe ancestors watched through the flicker of the fire. Whatever they believed, it gave life structure, and it gave groups unity. Culture wasn't a luxury. It was the glue that held communities together when everything else was falling apart. What's most remarkable is that none of this was necessary for pure survival. You don't need jewelry, flutes, or mammoth-shaped pendants to kill a deer. But early humans made them anyway, because humans don't just exist. We reflect, we decorate, we sing badly into the void. Creativity helped form identity. It gave people a sense of who they were, not just what they needed. Even jewelry tells a story. Shells, teeth, carved stones, and woven fibers were turned into necklaces, bracelets, and ornaments. These weren't just pretty. They may have indicated clan affiliation, personal status, or achievements. Basically, yes, this mammoth tooth necklace means I've seen some things. And here's the kicker. Creativity thrived, not in spite of the cold and danger, but because of it. When life is unpredictable and nature is brutal, people look for meaning. They make beauty in the bleakness. A carved bone becomes a message. A painting becomes a memory. A song becomes a lifeline that says, "We are still here." Early humans didn't just survive the Ice Age. They walked out of it, dusted off the snow, and said, "What's next?" Surviving the Ice Age was kind of like playing the world's most extreme version of The Floor is Lava, except in reverse. The floor wasn't lava, it was permafrost, ice sheets, and frozen mammoth poop. For thousands of years, early humans battled the cold, dodged predators, kept the fire alive, and somehow managed to invent art, bone flutes, and possibly sarcasm. But here's the most shocking part. They didn't just survive it, they won. So how did humanity pull it off? How did Homo sapiens, a species without fur, claws, or a built-in tolerance for being frozen solid, outlast the Ice Age and walk away as the reigning champions of Earth? The answer is a tale of migration, adaptation, and just enough stubborn optimism to make you keep moving, even when your feet are literally frostbitten. Let's start with migration, because early humans were the OG travelers. When things got too cold, too dry, or too mammoth-infested, they moved. Across rivers, through forests, over mountains, and yes, even across continents. One of the greatest feats in human history was the crossing of Beringia, the now sunken land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska during glacial periods when sea levels were dramatically lower. Picture this. You're bundled in layers of reindeer hide, hauling everything you own on your back, navigating a wind-blasted, icy plain stretching endlessly in every direction, while your kids complain that they're hungry and the mammoths all look grumpy. And yet, these people did it. They crossed from Asia into North America, likely in small waves over generations, eventually spreading south and populating an entirely new continent. And they did it without maps, compasses, or Google Earth, just observation, intuition, and the kind of risk-taking spirit that says, I bet there's food over that next glacier. Meanwhile, humans were fanning out across Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and beyond. Each group adapted to their local environment, not with genetic mutations, though there were a few handy ones, like lighter skin for vitamin D absorption in the north, but mostly through behavioral flexibility. You know, the classic, let's try not dying in a different way today, strategy. Now, about those other humans. Yes, there were others. Most famously, the Neanderthals, stockier, stronger, and with brow ridges that could intimidate a gorilla. Neanderthals were built for the cold. For a while, they were actually doing pretty well in Europe, using tools, burying their dead, and possibly humming sad Ice Age tunes to themselves. But somewhere around 40,000 years ago, they started disappearing. Why? The answer isn't a gladiator-style showdown between Team Sapiens and Team Neanderthal, though let's admit it, we'd watch that movie. Instead, it was probably a slow, sad fade-out. Homo sapiens had bigger social networks, more diverse diets, and more efficient tools. They traveled farther, exchanged ideas more frequently, and adapted to change like champs. Neanderthals, on the other hand, may have been too specialized, great in cold Europe, less great when the climate started swinging like a caffeinated metronome. And oh boy, did the climate change. The Ice Age wasn't just one long, uninterrupted blizzard. It was chaotic, with abrupt warmings and sudden deep freezes. Forests replaced tundras and vice versa in the blink of a few centuries. Those who could adapt survived. Those who couldn't, didn't. And our ancestors, they thrived on change like it was a new protein source. Eventually, as the glaciers retreated and the planet warmed, thanks Milankovitch cycles, humans found themselves in a very strange new world, one where they didn't have to fight the cold every single day. With more stable climates came more stable food sources. People started experimenting with planting seeds, staying in one place, and domesticating animals. They didn't know it yet, but they were setting the stage for the agricultural revolution. Okay, at the moment we traded mammoth steak for barley porridge, and accidentally invented back pain from farming. But none of that would have been possible without the Ice Age training montage that came before it. The need to cooperate, build shelter, make tools, preserve food, and teach each other how not to die. Those were the survival skills that built civilizations. Ice Age humans weren't just cold weather wanderers. They were the prototype for everything that came after. Farmers, builders, artists, engineers, philosophers, and probably the first people to complain about morning chores. So when the last ice sheets melted and woolly mammoths faded into myth, humans kept going. They adapted again. They grew. They built. They didn't just walk out of the cold. They strutted, slightly frostbitten, holding a torch in one hand and a bone flute in the other, ready to change the world. And that, dear listener, is how you beat the Ice Age. Not by being the strongest, fastest, or furriest, but by being the cleverest, chattiest, and most annoyingly determined species on the planet. The good news? You've been born in one of the most iconic civilizations in history. The bad news? You're not a pharaoh. You're probably not even a scribe. In fact, odds are good, you're somewhere between mud hauler and fish gutter on the social ladder. Welcome to ancient Egypt, land of monumental pyramids, glittering temples, and about 97% of the population sweating under the sun. Life in Egypt was inextricably tied to one moody, all-powerful force, the Nile River. Every year, like clockwork, it would flood its banks, leaving behind a glorious coating of black silt that made the surrounding land fertile and habitable. Egyptians didn't just farm near the Nile, they orbited it like ancient satellites. Without it, Egypt would have been little more than a sunburned stretch of sand full of people dramatically dying of thirst. Because of this, the ancient Egyptians weren't just grateful for the Nile, they worshipped it. They sang songs about it. They built gods around it. If the Nile had a fan club, everyone was in it. Pharaohs claimed their power from divine favor, but even they knew to tip their crown to the big blue god that watered their grain fields. Agriculture wasn't just the foundation of the economy. It was the backbone of society. Crops like wheat, barley, and flax weren't just food or fabric, they were life. If your harvest failed, you weren't ordering takeout from the nearest kebab vendor. You were offering frantic prayers to Harpy, the Nile god, and hoping your neighbors had worse luck so you could barter with moldy onions. Speaking of prayers and gods, ancient Egyptians had a lot of both. Their religion was less of a casual Sunday affair and more of a full-time, all-consuming lifestyle. Gods were everywhere. There were gods for the sun, the moon, the river, cats, embalming, childbirth, mummification, crocodiles, and even beer. In short, if something existed, it probably had a deity, and if it didn't, someone was probably in the process of carving one into a wall. At the very top of this divine pyramid, literally and figuratively, stood the pharaoh, a god on earth, the living embodiment of divine order. More practically, the guy who got the best bed and the least amount of sun exposure. The pharaoh didn't just rule the land, he was the land. If the harvest was bad, it was his fault. If the gods were mad, he was the one they ghosted. A glamorous job, yes, but also one with high expectations and a very real risk of being assassinated by your half-brother during a banquet. Beneath the pharaoh, society cascaded down like a sand dune of rigid hierarchy. At the very top of the mortal food chain were priests, who handled the gods' daily routines, feeding statues, organizing rituals, and making sure no one accidentally angered a falcon-headed sky god. These priests wore pristine linen, walked barefoot on sacred ground, and probably smelled like imported incense while the average farmer smelled like sweat and regret. Then came the scribes, nobles, military officials and merchants, basically anyone who didn't have to dig ditches or drag limestone blocks. These people were literate, connected, and generally less blistered by the sun. They had homes, servants, and the occasional luxury of not waking up at dawn to herd goats. And then came everyone else. The vast majority of Egyptians were laborers, farmers, fishermen, herders, and craftspeople. People whose hands were permanently dirty, and whose dreams of promotion were about as realistic as a hippo ballet. They built monuments for rulers they'd never meet, paid taxes in crops they barely kept, and prayed for a day off that never came. But don't think ancient Egyptians were joyless drones. Despite the crushing labor, their lives were filled with music, beer, festivals, and a good bit of sarcastic graffiti. Yes, ancient Egyptians had a sense of humor. Some jokes scrawled on tomb walls include things like, "Don't trust that guy, he steals bread," and "Naked man, why are you here?" So it wasn't all doom and hieroglyphs. They laughed, they danced, they definitely side-eyed their bosses behind their backs. Of course, there were rules. You couldn't just wander into a temple unless you were ritually clean, and ritually clean didn't mean a 5-second rinse. It meant full-body purification, sometimes with natron salts, and avoiding certain foods, drinks, and awkwardly enough sex. So unless you were extremely dedicated to spiritual purity, or got paid in gold, you were better off admiring the temple from the outside and hoping you didn't sneeze near a sacred ibis. And then there were the cats, but we'll get to them later. For now, just remember, in ancient Egypt, the social pyramid was as solid as the stone ones. If you were born at the bottom, you weren't climbing it. You were too busy carrying the blocks. In ancient Egypt, you either worshipped a god, worked for one, or got sunburned trying. Let's clear something up right away. Pyramids were not built by slaves. That's a myth. And while it makes for a dramatic story, complete with chains, whips, and dramatic chanting, it's simply not true. In reality, they were built by workers, overworked, under-rested, onion-fueled workers. But they were technically free citizens, and they even got paid with onions. You may be wondering what sort of person signs up to drag multi-ton stone blocks through the blistering desert heat for a living. The answer? Someone who didn't have Twitter, air conditioning, or labor laws. Also, someone who probably didn't have a better option. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the world's most overachieving triangle, was built during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, around 2550 BCE. And contrary to popular belief, it wasn't tossed together by random slaves whipped into submission. Archaeological digs near the pyramids uncovered evidence of workers' villages, complete with dormitories, bakeries, beer jugs, and the occasional chicken bone. These weren't prisoners, they were teams of laborers, organized into crews with names like the Friends of Khufu and the drunk guys who probably dropped a block once. Okay, that second one's not confirmed, but statistically probable. These laborers were part of a highly structured workforce, roughly 20,000 to 30,000 men, divided into rotating crews that worked in shifts of a few months at a time. Some were skilled artisans, Most were muscle on loan from the countryside during the agricultural off-season. When the Nile flooded the fields, farming was a no-go. So instead, you went to Giza and moved rocks for the state. That's right. Vacation was pyramid season, and yes, they were paid. Not in gold or jewels, of course, but in grain, beer, bread, garlic, and onions. Foods designed less for delight and more for surviving another day in the sun. The humble onion was not only currency but also nutrition, and likely deodorant by default. How do you smell after 10 hours hauling limestone? Better than you'd think, got paid in onions. Then there was the beer. Egyptians loved beer, like modern humans love Wi-Fi. It wasn't just a reward, it was daily sustenance. Pyramid workers reportedly received around 4 liters of beer per day. That's not a typo. 4 liters every day. Imagine clocking in for your shift and your manager says, "Right, here's your hammer and your growler. Don't fall in the quarry." Was the work hard? That's like asking if the sun is warm. These guys were dragging stones weighing anywhere from 2 to 80 tons using sleds, manpower, and some ingenious engineering. They had to level the land, carve ramps, chisel stone, and somehow not die in the process. There were no forklifts, just calloused hands, sore backs, and sheer willpower powered by barley and hope. Injuries were common, and ancient Egyptian medical care was ambitious. Workers who broke bones, crushed toes, or got infected wounds were sent to makeshift infirmaries, where some help was available. The more elite among them, stonecutters and artisans for example, sometimes got surprisingly decent care. For others, treatment was essentially, here, smear this honey on it, and don't bleed on the pharaoh's face carving. Papyrus scrolls like the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus give us some insight into how they handled injuries. Dislocated jaw, push it back in, and bandage with linen soaked in beer. Splinters, extract with a copper blade and pray to Sekhmet. Severed fingers, well, you had 9 more. Efficiency. But here's the real kicker. They were proud of their work. Carvings and graffiti left by crews show camaraderie, loyalty, and even humor. These weren't just faceless labor drones. They were men with lives, rivalries, inside jokes, and the occasional complaint scratched into a block like, "This ramp is killing me." And why did they work so hard for so little? Religion, legacy, and beer-fueled pride. Building a pyramid wasn't just a job, it was sacred. A way to serve the gods, the king, and earn a better shot in the afterlife. In a culture where death was just a really long vacation with better furniture, earning spiritual brownie points by helping build the pharaoh's eternal condo made sense. Plus, it wasn't all hauling and yelling. Between shifts, workers enjoyed food, sleep, and the occasional festival. There were musicians, dancers, and probably more gossip than your average coffee shop. Think extreme construction site meets summer camp, but hotter and dustier, and with a very angry supervisor who believes he's semi-divine. And when a worker died, especially one of high skill, they were sometimes buried near the pyramid they helped build, a rare honor. That's right. You could literally work yourself into history. So no, they weren't slaves, but they were exhausted, sweaty, sunburned, overworked, and paid in things you'd normally find in a soup. They didn't build the pyramids because they were forced. They built them because it was the job, and like any job, it came with its own perks. You know, like 3 beers a day and the promise of back pain forever. In a world where 99% of the population couldn't even write their own name. Being a scribe was like having superpowers, if your superpower involved endless paperwork and occasional papyrus splinters. Scribes were the ancient Egyptian equivalent of bureaucratic royalty, literate, respected, often well-fed, and absolutely crucial to keeping the gears of Pharaoh's massive god-powered engine running. Were they warriors? No. Did they save lives? Also no. But if you needed an inventory of sacred geese, these guys were your MVPs. Let's start at the beginning, literally. Becoming a scribe didn't happen overnight. You couldn't just wake up one day, grab a reed pen, and start doodling falcons and eyeballs. Scribes underwent years of education starting in childhood, usually from elite or middle-ranking families. If your dad was a scribe, odds are you were being handed a stylus as soon as you stopped drooling on your blanket. Education took place in a formal setting, known as the House of Life, where students memorized an absurd number of hieroglyphs, practiced copying official texts, and learned how to keep their ink from smudging on papyrus scrolls that cost more than your monthly beer ration. Teachers were strict, often fond of motivational discipline, which loosely translates to hit them with a stick until they learn to write the symbol for grain tax properly. But if you survived that educational gauntlet, you were in. You joined the sacred and elite rank of literate humans, less than 1% of the population. In ancient Egypt, literacy was power. It was access to administration, government, land, religion, and wealth. While others were farming onions and hauling limestone, scribes were sitting in shady corners writing detailed reports on how many onions were being hauled, and by whom. And let's be clear, they weren't just writing poetry and love notes. Scribes were the backbone of the ancient bureaucracy, an army of ink-stained record keepers, tasked with maintaining the pharaoh's grip on the land. Their job included writing tax records, legal documents, construction orders, military rosters, crop inventories, warehouse lists, temple transactions, and yes, documenting how many cows were delivered to the temple of Pa this week. Not the sexiest of workloads, perhaps, but it gave scribes something no one else had: political access. They could read and write the king's decrees, interpret religious texts, and deliver reports to high officials. Many rose to become advisors, tax collectors, or priests. Others found themselves running entire departments of grain distribution, which in Egypt was basically controlling the national bloodstream. Still, the job had its frustrations. Ever tried writing in hieratic script while your ink dries out in the sun, and someone's yelling about the wrong unit count on a goat shipment? Now imagine doing that with no eraser. Scribes had to be precise, consistent, and fast. And if there was a typo in your decree, and a city got taxed twice by accident, that's your career, and possibly your head, on the line. They also had to work closely with the most powerful people in the land, which meant cultivating the ancient art of professional brown-nosing. Pharaohs expected absolute loyalty, nobles wanted flattery, temple overseers demanded reverence. A good scribe had to write flowery praise that bordered on poetry. A great scribe could do it while knowing full well that the noble he was complimenting had the personality of damp sand. Let's talk tools. No MacBooks here, just styluses made from reeds. Black and red ink. Red was for headings, danger, or the pharaoh's name, and scrolls of papyrus that were about as easy to work with as a roll of damp tissue. Mistakes were handled with scraping and rewrites. No undo button, only you just wasted 3 days' work. And yet, being a scribe came with real perks. You didn't farm, you didn't fight. You usually had sandals, real food, and a roof over your head. You got invited to ceremonies, festivals, and temple feasts. You were trusted, admired, and most importantly, you knew how to read, when 99% of people didn't even know what reading was. That kind of power was intoxicating. So intoxicating, in fact, that tomb inscriptions from scribes often boast not of military valor or riches, but of how neat their handwriting was. Case in point, the Satire of the Trades, a famous ancient Egyptian text written by a scribe teacher, is basically a 3,000-year-old motivational pamphlet for kids learning to write. In it, the teacher mocks every other profession. Farmers are filthy, soldiers are doomed, leather workers smell terrible, and then ends with a glowing endorsement of scribes, who do not have to carry a hoe and are not beaten like donkeys. That's one way to advertise a career path. Be a scribe, less beatings, more papyrus. But being at the top of the writing heap came with its own form of pressure. The pharaoh's court didn't accept excuses. If a scribe messed up a figure or forgot a symbol, there could be consequences, serious ones, because when the guy paying your salary also thinks he's a living god, typos can be lethal. Still, for all the stress and all the ink-stained fingers, scribes were the white-collar elite of the ancient world. They didn't build the pyramids, they wrote about who did. They didn't lead armies, they counted the arrows. They didn't farm, but they taxed the farmers and made sure the records survived. Scribes had status, sure, but they also got blamed for bad handwriting 3,000 years before doctors did. Some people are born to paint, others are born to lead. And then there are those rare special few who say, "You know what I want to do with my life? Scoop brains out of corpses with a hook and make sure the dead look fabulous for eternity." Welcome to the noble, nose-wrinkling world of the ancient Egyptian embalmer, the real MVPs of the afterlife industry. In Egypt, Death was not the end. It was just the start of a very long and paperwork-heavy journey to the great beyond. The Egyptians believed that the body needed to be preserved, so the Ka life force and Ba soul, with occasional bird privileges, could reunite with it in the afterlife. But to do that, the body had to be in decent shape. Enter the embalmer. Priest, scientist, mortician, and part-time taxidermist, with an unnervingly steady hand. Let's start with the process. Mummification wasn't just a casual wrap and bury situation. It was a multi-week, full-body horror show with more steps than a ceremonial dance. The top-tier method, the kind reserved for royals, nobles, and people who could afford a deluxe post-death spa package, involved at least 70 days of careful, smelly work. Step 1. Remove the squishy stuff. You don't want things rotting inside the dearly departed, so embalmers got to work removing internal organs. The stomach, intestines, liver and lungs were all carefully extracted, sometimes through a small incision in the abdomen. These were then placed in canopic jars, each guarded by a protective deity. Think of them as ancient Tupperware, only divine and shaped like animal heads. But the brain, that got different treatment. Since the Egyptians didn't think the brain did much, it was basically ancient filler material. Embalmers got rid of it, the old-fashioned way. They shoved a long, hooked instrument up the nose and wiggled. The goal? Liquefy the brain and let it drain out through the nostrils, like the world's least appetizing smoothie. There is no nice way to describe this part. Even ancient Egyptians probably winced and said, "Ugh, poor guy." Next came the drying phase. The body was buried under heaps of natron, a naturally occurring salt that basically turned your corpse into ancient jerky. For 40 days, the body just sat there, leaching fluids and becoming less corpse-like and more parchment-esque. Embalmers would check in now and then, probably making awkward small talk like, "He's looking good, nice and crusty." Once dried, the body was washed, oiled, and stuffed with linen, sawdust, or even onions to make it look lifelike. Then came the wrapping. Meter upon meter of linen strips, soaked in resin, carefully applied in layers. Amulets were slipped between layers for protection, and prayers were chanted with every pass. Think of it as extreme gift wrapping, if the gift were a dehydrated aristocrat heading to the underworld. But embalmers weren't just glorified corpse decorators, they were ritual specialists. The act of mummification was a sacred rite full of spells, incantations, and ceremonial purity. Certain embalmers wore jackal masks to represent Anubis, the god of embalming, and some of the final rituals included the opening of the mouth, a symbolic act meant to restore the dead's senses in the afterlife, so they could eat, speak, and complain about their kids like they used to. Despite all this spiritual importance, embalmers had an awkward place in society. On one hand, they were absolutely essential. Without them, no one was getting into the field of reeds, Egyptian heaven, now with less mosquitoes. On the other hand, they spent their lives elbow deep in rotting flesh, which made them something of a social pariah. It's hard to get invited to dinner parties when everyone assumes you smell like a fermentation experiment gone wrong. They operated in specialized facilities, often attached to temples or necropolises. Some were part of hereditary guilds, passing down their stomach-turning trade from father to son. Others were priests with specific duties in the embalming process. It wasn't a job you casually applied for, it was a calling, usually accompanied by ritual purification, magical knowledge, and a rock-solid ability to not faint. And while most embalmers worked on average citizens or minor officials, the best of the best got called in for royal gigs. These were the guys who embalmed kings, queens, and high priests, essentially the red carpet treatment of the ancient mortuary world. Their work was so valued that some were buried near their elite clients, rewarded for ensuring that the pharaoh wouldn't enter the afterlife with his nostrils leaking brain juice. There was also intense secrecy surrounding the art. Recipes for embalming oils, spells, and the proper layering of linens were closely guarded knowledge. Think of it like ancient intellectual property, only instead of being protected by lawyers, it was protected by divine curses and priests with sharp knives. So next time you admire a well-preserved mummy in a museum, remember someone possibly wearing a jackal mask and humming funeral hymns spent weeks massaging that corpse with oils, stuffing it with sawdust, and reciting protective spells, all for the grand honor of making sure the deceased didn't show up to eternity, looking like spoiled fish. It takes a special person to say, "Hey, I'll be the guy who removes internal organs through the nose. Ancient Egypt was a land of magnificent temples, monuments carved with hieroglyphs, towering columns, kissed by sunlight, and statues of gods so lifelike, they probably intimidated pigeons. From the outside, these holy sites radiated eternal power and divine elegance, but inside, someone was up to their elbows in bird poop, incense ash, and angry priest side-eye. Welcome to the world of the temple cleaner. Possibly the least glorified position in the ancient spiritual ecosystem. Temples weren't just places to pray, they were the beating heart of Egyptian religious life, political control, and economic storage. They held grain, gold, papyrus scrolls, sacred relics, and approximately 5,000 opportunities for things to get dirty. Worship wasn't just about whispering to the gods, it was about maintaining appearances, and that meant spotless floors, gleaming statues and altars that didn't smell like yesterday's fish offerings. That's where our underdog heroes came in. The average temple was massive, sometimes the size of small towns. Take Karnak, for example. It sprawled across over 200 acres and featured hundreds of chambers, courtyards and columns. Cleaning it wasn't a job, it was a lifestyle. Temple cleaners would rise early, grab their tools, which probably included brooms, scrapers, buckets, linen cloths, and a silent prayer for endurance, and get to work before the first priest even began chanting. Let's talk assignments. Some were tasked with cleaning statues of gods, which was a high honor and high pressure. These weren't just decorations. These statues were believed to be living embodiments of the gods. If you chipped one, scratched one, or left a suspicious smudge on Rose's divine cheek, you were going to have a very bad day. And by bad day, we mean possibly cursed for life and exiled to mop crocodile pens. Ah yes, the crocodile pens. You see, some temples, especially those dedicated to Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of strength and fertility, kept live crocodiles on site. These were sacred animals, tended to with ritual care, fancy food, and unfortunately, zero bladder control. So someone had to sweep out their pens, dispose of the dung, and make sure the holy reptiles didn't swallow a co-worker. Imagine waking up and knowing your workday involved dodging aggressive river monsters and making their poop sparkle. Not enough incense in the world. Then there were the sacred geese, beloved in certain temples and known across history as the feathery harbingers of chaos. They were loud, they were territorial, and if you got too close while cleaning the grain stores or refilling the water basins, they'd absolutely launch a surprise honk and peck attack on your dignity. Ancient Egyptian temples may have lacked surveillance cameras, but if there was a fight between a cleaner and a goose, you know someone carved it into a wall. Beyond animals, temple cleaners handled the daily maintenance of floors, walls, altars, and ritual tools. Holy spaces had to be kept pristine for offerings, processions, and ceremonies. This meant scrubbing limestone until it gleamed, replacing worn-out incense burners, and sweeping sand out of spaces that absolutely did not want to stay sand-free. Sand, after all, is the glitter of the desert. It gets everywhere, no matter how hard you try. But the real challenge wasn't the work, it was the supervision. Temples were tightly controlled by high priests, many of whom treated sacred order like a personal obsession. Cleaning crews had to work silently, swiftly, and invisibly, lest they interrupt a ritual or smudge the wrong glyph. One clumsy misstep, and suddenly you're being screamed at by a man in a leopard skin robe, who thinks the ibis statue is frowning now. And forget thanks, or public recognition. Temple cleaners didn't get name plaques or free grain rations. At best, they got a nod of approval. At worst, they got blamed for whatever bad omen happened to show up that week. The Nile's flooding too much. Must be the guy who spilled water on the altar again. Still, there were upsides. Cleaning temples meant proximity to power. You heard things. You saw things. Maybe a high priest muttered a secret prayer in front of you. Maybe you overheard a political conspiracy while scrubbing the sacred stairwell. Some temple cleaners eventually moved up the ladder to assistant roles, or even minor priestly positions, if they managed to survive the geese and avoid accidentally defiling a divine floor tile. And most importantly, they were considered ritually pure enough to be inside the holy spaces. That alone put them leagues above the average goat herder. They might have been wiping up goat entrails from a sacrificial offering, but hey, they were doing it inside the house of the gods. That counted for something in the next life. The The role of the temple cleaner proves that even the most divine place in the land needed someone behind the scenes, quietly scrubbing away, making sure the gods' home stayed camera-ready for eternity. When the gods said, "Keep my house clean," they didn't mean spiritually, they meant right now. If the pharaoh was the face of Egypt, the farmers were its calloused, sunburned hands, and let's be honest, those hands were almost always dirty. In a civilization built on divine kings and stone monuments, it's easy to forget who was actually keeping the place running. Spoiler, it wasn't the guys wearing gold necklaces and lounging in lotus ponds. It was the millions of farmers who spent their lives elbow deep in mud and slightly different mud, coaxing food from the land so the rest of society could keep pretending they were gods. But this wasn't just any land. This was land made possible by the Nile River, Egypt's lifeline, blessing, and occasional disaster machine. Every year the Nile would rise and flood its banks, turning the desert into a massive, muddy canvas of fertility. It was like nature giving the soil a spa treatment. When the water receded, it left behind a nutrient-rich layer of silt, so good at growing stuff. It could probably sprout onions out of pure spite. This created a 3-season farming calendar. Arket. Flooding, season June to September. Fields were underwater, farming paused, and farmers were volunteered for national construction projects. Peret. Growing season, October to February. Everyone rushed to plant crops before the land dried out again. Shimu. Harvest season, March to May. Time to reap what you sowed and nervously calculate how much of it the government was about to confiscate. And yes, you read that right. During flood season, farmers didn't rest. They got drafted into labor crews for temple expansions, canal dredging, or pyramid projects. Oh, the Nile flooded your home. That's cute. Grab a shovel and start hauling sandstone. It was a never-ending cycle of bending, lifting, planting, harvesting, and muttering curse words at clouds that didn't rain. Most farmers didn't own the land they worked. They leased it from the state, temples, or nobility, which meant that even if they grew a record-breaking barley crop, a chunk of it went straight into the hands of someone who had never touched a hoe in their life. And let's talk about taxes, the ancient Egyptian version of a fun killer. Taxation wasn't just a civic duty, it was a looming, ever-present doom cloud. Government officials would show up during harvest with scribes, ledgers, and an uncanny ability to spot that extra sheaf of wheat you tried to hide behind the donkey. What did they want? A portion of your harvest, of course. In grain, mostly, but also sometimes in linen, oil, honey, and livestock. If you couldn't pay, you might be forced to give up tools, animals, or even your labor. That's right. Tax debt could make you a temporary servant, farming someone else's field, because the gods apparently needed more leeks this year. And while farmers were the foundation of the economy, socially, they were hovering somewhere between necessary and forgettable. They rarely had formal education, had zero political power, and didn't get fancy tombs unless they somehow made friends with a noble who became the pharaoh's favorite barley supplier. What did they get in return for all this back-breaking toil? If they were lucky, a roof, a small patch of land, a few goats, and a family to pass their blisters down to. Meals were simple: bread, onions, lentils, and beer. Always beer. You needed something to make digging irrigation channels under the noon sun seem like a good life decision. But don't assume they were all miserable. Ancient Egyptian farmers often lived in tight-knit village communities where they shared tools, stories, gossip, and the occasional grudge match over who stole whose ox last planting season. They had festivals, music, and religious rituals tied to planting and harvesting. Every major event was linked to the gods, especially Osiris, who doubled as the deity of agriculture and the afterlife, which probably felt like a 2-for-1 deal if your wheat kept failing. They even had proverbs like, "If you would know a man, watch him in the field, not in the marketplace." Translation: it's easy to talk big, but if you can't handle a shovel, no one's impressed. Still, the sheer physical toll of the job was enormous. Constant exposure to the elements, repetitive motion injuries, infections, parasites, and the occasional angry hippo made farming in ancient Egypt less peaceful nature job and more grueling outdoor endurance challenge with bonus plagues. And the worst part? If something went wrong, if the Nile flooded too little or too much, or your cows all got a mysterious case of falling over and dying, you still owed taxes. No crop, no excuse. You'd better borrow grain from your neighbor, offer your cousin into labor service, or start praying Osiris accepts apologies in the form of very sincere tears. It's no wonder Egyptian farmers had a deep spiritual life. When your daily grind involves sunstroke and sand in every possible crevice, it helps to believe there's a better life waiting after this one. Preferably one with shade. Farmers worked so hard that even the cows pitied them. If you were an ancient Egyptian, and your life goal included long walks through the desert, getting hit in the face with a club, and being paid mostly in grain, then congratulations, you were probably a soldier. To many in the ancient world, military service was a fast track to glory, status, and maybe, just maybe, a shiny bronze sword of your very own. In Egypt, it was more like a fast track to sore feet, sand in your ears, and a future of questionable dental health. Still, being a soldier of Pharaoh wasn't without its perks, assuming you survived long enough to collect them. Egypt didn't have a standing army in its early dynasties. Instead, it relied on militia-style levies. Essentially, congratulations, peasant. You're now part of Egypt's defense strategy. But as the kingdom expanded, and especially once it began running into its neighbors in places like Nubia and Canaan, things got more professional. By the New Kingdom soon, 1550 BCE, Egypt had a full-time military, a real fighting force with ranks, training, armor, and a whole lot of blisters. Training for soldiers began in youth, and often took place in military compounds or garrisons near borders or royal cities. Recruits learned how to march in formation, wield weapons like spears, axes, bows, and slings, and shout for Pharaoh, without sounding like they were about to cry. Fitness was essential. If you couldn't jog across the dunes with a shield and 50 pounds of gear, you were probably reassigned to latrine guard, the least glamorous military honor available. The Egyptian army had different branches: infantry, archers, charioteers, and naval forces patrolling the Nile. The elite chariot corps was basically the ancient version of a fighter pilot squad, flashy, well-fed, and only slightly less likely to get impaled by a javelin. Life on campaign was, in a word, awful. Egypt's major enemies included the Nubians to the south, the Libyans to the west, and various city-states in Canaan and the Levant to the northeast. These were not fun vacations. Soldiers would march for miles through scorching heat, sleep on rough mats or straight-up sand, eat preserved bread that doubled as a blunt weapon, and fight battles in terrain where snakes considered you a snack. Supply lines were long, water was precious, and wounds got infected faster than you could say, "Rad, save me." There were no medevac helicopters. If you got speared in the leg, your choices were 1. Walk it off, or 2. Dramatically expire while delivering a speech about honor and barley. And what did soldiers fight for? Loyalty to the pharaoh, for one. He wasn't just a king, he was a living god, which added a whole layer of spiritual guilt to deserting your post. There was also glory, the promise of loot, and a very real paycheck. Though by paycheck we mean bags of grain, a few cuts of meat, and maybe a bronze dagger if your commander liked you. If a soldier distinguished himself, he might receive land, cattle, or even be promoted to command a unit, meaning he got to shout orders and fill out scrolls instead of getting personally stabbed. The truly elite soldiers might guard royal palaces or temples, becoming trusted enforcers for high-ranking officials, or even Pharaoh himself. One surprising perk of military life: retirement packages. If you didn't die horribly in the field, you could actually retire with a plot of land, a home, and the very adult-sounding job of local peacekeeper. These veterans were respected in their communities, like ancient mall cops with spears, and could often pass their military titles on to their sons. But let's not romanticize too much. Most soldiers weren't swinging swords against evil invaders every day. A lot of their time was spent patrolling borders, guarding storehouses, protecting trade routes, and chasing down tomb robbers, which was basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of catching someone spray painting Ra is mid on sacred walls. They also did a lot of standing in ceremonies, standing at gates, standing in the sun waiting for priests to finish another 10-hour ritual. The real war wasn't always with enemies. It was with heat stroke, and if morale dipped, pharaohs were smart. They kept the men motivated with promises of divine favor, celebratory beer, and war songs boasting about how many enemies had been smitten by Egyptian might. There was a lot of smiting. If you didn't smite at least one person before lunch, were you even trying? Tombs and monuments sometimes show victorious soldiers marching home with captives, loot, or exotic animals. Whether or not the average soldier actually got to keep any of that is debatable. More likely, they got the honor of watching the pharaoh receive it while they went back to sleeping next to a horse with indigestion. But even with all the sand in their shoes and arrows in their general direction, soldiers were proud. They weren't just muscle. They were the protectors of Maat, the cosmic order. Without them, Egypt would have been raided, ransacked, or ruled by someone without the proper sun disk hat. Ancient Egyptian soldiers risked their lives for glory, honor, and a bag of barley. When you walk through a museum filled with ancient Egyptian wonders, the gold masks, delicately carved statues, and tomb walls bursting with vibrant color, you probably think of pharaohs, gods, or curses involving beetles. What you should be thinking is, wow, someone with a sore back and unpaid bills made this. Welcome to the world of Egyptian artisans and craftsmen, the anonymous geniuses who built eternity with a chisel in one hand and a half-eaten onion in the other. Let's start with the place many of them called home, Deir el-Medina. This walled village on the west bank of the Nile was where some of Egypt's most skilled laborers lived and worked during the New Kingdom, circa 1550-1070 BCE. Their job? Construct and decorate the tombs of the kings in the Valley of the Kings. You know, just casual interior design for gods on earth. Now don't picture a dusty shantytown. Deir el-Medina was organized, tightly run, and full of cultural life. Workers were state employees, provided with housing, tools, food rations, and even medical attention. They had their own community of painters, masons, carpenters, sculptors, and scribes, plus a side hustle in spiritual graffiti, where some snuck in naughty or sarcastic drawings on scraps of limestone. Archaeologists are still giggling over these. But while their work was immortal, they were not. These were not wealthy men. They didn't get golden statues or parade processions. Instead, they labored in silence under heavy expectations and constant oversight. 4 men monitored daily progress, and government officials kept records of attendance with all the joy of a DMV clerk on a caffeine crash. And the deadlines, unforgiving. Pharaohs expected their tombs to be completed before death, or at least before their grandsons took the throne. These projects took decades, and every detail had to be perfect. From aligning corridors with star patterns to painting entire walls in the style of divine instruction manuals, nothing was done halfway. Imagine spending 3 weeks painting the feathers on a falcon god's left wing, only to be told that shade of blue is too mortal. Artisans worked in gangs, each with specific jobs. Some carved stone reliefs, others painted or smoothed plaster, and some hauled supplies or maintained tools. Their designs were guided by religious texts and mythological imagery, but their execution required creativity, anatomical knowledge, and the ability to paint sideways in a space barely big enough for a crouched hippo. And it wasn't just tombs. Craftsmen were responsible for everything from temple statues to ceremonial jewelry, often made from wood, faience, copper, or semi-precious stones. These were objects so finely made that modern jewelers still marvel at how anyone pulled it off without magnifying glasses, or fingers that hadn't been crushed by a hammer in year 3 of training. Despite their talent, artisans often lived paycheck to paycheck. And by paycheck, of course, we mean bags of grain, oil, fish, and beer, which were rationed out based on their job and rank. If deliveries were late, and they often were, the workers got angry. And once, very famously, they struck. That's right. The first recorded labor strike in history happened in Deir el-Medina around 1150 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses III. When wages didn't arrive, the workers stopped carving and painting and marched to the local temple demanding payment. They even brought their own supplies and staged a sit-in. The message was clear: we're not decorating your eternal afterlife until we get our fish. What's amazing is that the strike worked. Officials scrambled to deliver overdue rations, and the workers got back to, well, making Pharaoh's underground condo presentable for eternity. It was a rare moment when the invisible hands behind Egypt's grandeur said, "We'd like to be slightly less invisible, please." Still, credit was rare. While the tombs bore the names of kings and gods, the men who carved them were usually left unnamed. A few lucky artisans managed to scratch their names into stone near their masterpieces. Humble lines like, "Made by the servant of the place of truth, Nakt," which is Egyptian for "I did this." And yes, I'm amazing. And the pressure? Immense. Because if you messed up, if you carved the wrong god, painted an ibis instead of a jackal, or forgot to include the correct afterlife spell, you weren't just making a mistake, you were messing up a soul's eternal journey. No pressure though. Their lives were a strange mix of pride and poverty. They were deeply respected for their skills, yet still burdened by shortages, deadlines, and harsh oversight. They created monuments of divine perfection. While walking to work in sandals they had patched 4 times, they built eternity, but couldn't afford new sandals. When you think of ancient Egypt, you might picture towering statues, god-kings with eyeliner, and elaborate tombs filled with gold. But behind all that grandeur was a workforce that wasn't entirely male, and some of the most interesting, complicated, and quietly revolutionary stories belong to the women who powered Egypt's economy, temples and homes. Now, let's be clear, ancient Egypt was no feminist utopia. It was still a patriarchal society, and women had to navigate layers of legal, social, and religious restrictions to claim even a sliver of independence. But compared to many ancient civilizations, Egypt was surprisingly progressive in some key areas. Women could own property, inherit wealth, run businesses, divorce their husbands, and even sue jerks who owed them grain. In Mesopotamia, that might get you stoned. In Egypt, you might win the lawsuit and get the grain. So what kinds of jobs could a woman do? Let's start with the real foundation of the economy: domestic labor. The majority of Egyptian women spent their lives running households, raising children, baking bread, grinding grain, weaving linen, and brewing beer, and not in a quaint cottage-core kind of way. These were full-time, exhausting jobs that required skill, strength, and the patience to deal with husbands who thought cutting wheat was harder than raising 6 kids during a locust season. Textile work in particular was massive. Women wove linen cloth, not only for their families but for sale, trade, or temple use. Linen was the fabric of choice in Egypt's boiling hot climate, and everyone from peasants to pharaohs needed it. Women might spin thread, dye cloth, or sew garments in workshops or right in their homes. It was a job that kept the looms rattling and the markets moving. Then there was beer brewing, arguably the most important job in all of Egypt. Beer wasn't just a recreational drink, it was daily nutrition. Everyone drank it, from toddlers to tomb builders, and guess who made it? Women. It was one of the few professions that was not only open to women, but dominated by them. Think of them as the original brewmasters, mixing fermented grain with water, and sometimes herbs, creating the ancient equivalent of a protein shake, with a buzz. Women also worked in perfume making, another respected craft tied to both hygiene and religion. Smelling good in Egypt wasn't a luxury, it was practically a moral requirement. Temples burned incense constantly, and wealthy elites demanded scented oils and balms. Women created perfumes from myrrh, frankincense, lotus, and even exotic ingredients like imported cinnamon bark. If you were good at it, you weren't just a perfumer, you were a priestess of olfactory power. Speaking of temples, some women achieved high-status religious roles. Female priestesses, especially those titled Chantress of Amun, held ceremonial duties, participated in temple rituals, and sometimes wielded considerable influence. These were often women from elite families, well-trained in music, singing, and ritual performance. In a world where sound was sacred, being the voice that sang the gods awake came with status, and a better wardrobe than your average goat herder. There were also female doctors, rare, yes, but documented. The most famous was Pesachet, known as the Lady Overseer of Female Physicians, who lived during the Old Kingdom. She may have specialized in gynecology, childbirth, or general medicine. While most physicians were men, her existence proves that educated, professional women did exist, just in small determined numbers. And then, of course, we have the outliers, the women who didn't just bend the rules, but broke them over their royal headdresses. Enter Hatshepsut, Egypt's most successful female pharaoh. She wasn't a queen consort, not a mere regent. She declared herself pharaoh in full masculine regalia, complete with the ceremonial beard. Her reign brought prosperity, monumental construction, and diplomatic success. She rewrote the expectations of her gender with a stone chisel and a very loud royal decree. But for every Hatshepsut, there were thousands of women who weren't allowed near power, couldn't inherit land without male approval, and had no choice but to marry early, bear children, and quietly labor in the background. Many were poor, illiterate, and invisible to history, yet their work fueled the temples, markets, and fields, just as much as any male scribe or soldier. Women's legal rights, while progressive for their time, didn't always translate into real freedom. A woman could take her husband to court, but only if she could afford the court fees, knew the law, and wasn't married to a nobleman with friends in high priestly places. Social norms still prized obedience, modesty, and an unwavering commitment to keeping the bread ovens hot and the house swept. That said, some entrepreneurial women ran shops, especially in cities. Others hired out as wet nurses, midwives, or even musicians. If you were lucky and clever, you might run a household business producing cosmetics, pottery, or textiles. You might work in a temple workshop or serve in an estate as a steward. You might, in rare cases, live a life of quiet independence. But every step forward came with a cultural counterweight, a reminder that your place was usually just below the top, and often right next to a grinding stone. In most ancient societies, cats were just animals, mousers, vermin chasers, or the occasional accidental house guest. But in ancient Egypt, cats were divine royalty with whiskers. While your average farmer was sunburnt, taxed, and one sneeze away from a hippo-related accident, cats were out there living like small four-legged pharaohs, complete with personal chefs, state funerals, and immunity from legal prosecution. Let's rewind to the basics. Why did Egyptians worship cats? The answer lies somewhere between religion, pest control, and sheer feline charisma. Ancient Egypt was an agrarian society. That meant storing grain, and wherever you store grain, rodents follow like freeloaders at an open bar. Cats, being natural predators, were the silent guardians of granaries, homes, and temples. But the Egyptians didn't just thank them. They elevated them to sacred status. The goddess Basti, originally a lioness warrior deity, eventually evolved into a gentler domestic cat-headed goddess associated with home fertility and protection. She was revered not just as a divine figure, but as a symbol of motherhood, grace, and apparently the ability to nap 17 hours a day while still being adored. As Bastic's popularity grew, so did the status of her feline lookalikes. Cats weren't just pets. They were spiritual icons, thought to possess protective, even magical qualities. Egyptians believed cats kept away evil spirits. Killing one? A crime so severe it could result in execution. Yes, really. Accidentally run over a sacred cat? You'd better start preparing your will. Households treated their cats like members of the family, or, more accurately, like ruling members of the family. Archaeological finds suggest they were fed delicacies, like roasted fish, goose, and bread soaked in milk. They wore jeweled collars, lounged in the sun with zero job requirements, and were sometimes even dressed in tiny linen garments. While the average laborer was lucky to get onions for dinner, cats were out here, having royal meals, and probably turning up their noses if the fish wasn't poached just right. Even pharaohs had pet cats. In tomb paintings, cats appear beneath thrones, curled near feet, or, occasionally, in chairs, being fanned by human servants. Because if any creature was going to usurp the divine ruler's seat, it was the one who meowed into his face during official rituals. Temples dedicated to Bastet weren't just places of worship, they were cat sanctuaries. The most famous one was at Bubastis, a city that sounds like a sneeze and functioned like a luxury feline resort. Hundreds, possibly thousands of temple cats were cared for by priestesses and attendants. They received food, grooming, and, when their time came, a mummification worthy of nobility. That's right. Cat mummies were a huge deal. Archaeologists have uncovered millions of cat mummies, lovingly wrapped in linen and buried in dedicated cemeteries. Some were adorned with amulets. Others were placed in bronze sarcophagi, shaped like cats. People even bought mummified cats as offerings to Bastet. Think of it as divine bribery via adorable corpse. And when a beloved cat died, the family would shave their eyebrows in mourning. That's right. No black armbands or social media posts, just hairless foreheads and the sadness of knowing whiskers had entered the afterlife ahead of you. Considering most peasants didn't even get tombstones, this was premium end-of-life care. Legally, cats had rights. Hurting a cat, intentionally or not, could land you in court. One famous account from the 5th century BCE tells of a Roman soldier who killed a cat in Alexandria. Despite his political protection, the locals mobbed him to death. Justice for the kitty was swift and terrifying. Now this might all sound like pampered myth-making, but the reality is that cats were as much a part of the Egyptian social and spiritual ecosystem as priests and scribes. They were symbols of order, grace, and divine favor. They were pest control that came with cuddles. And unlike literally every other job we've covered in this series, cats did zero work and were still beloved. Compare that to the life of, say, a temple cleaner, who scrubbed bird dung off god statues and still got yelled at, or a farmer who fed the nation and got taxed into oblivion, or an embalmer who, let's be honest, earned every single coin he was underpaid. Meanwhile, the cat slept 18 hours a day and still got a temple built in its honor. So if reincarnation was real, and many Egyptians certainly believed it was, then everyone from scribes to soldiers probably prayed not to come back as royalty, or even a high priest. No, they wanted to return as a smug house cat, with servants, snacks, and no responsibilities, ever. If reincarnation was real, every Egyptian probably prayed to come back as a cat with servants, snacks, and no responsibilities. Why the microscope changed everything, and also ruined lunch. Once upon a time, before someone decided to point a lens at pond water and ruin everyone's appetite, the world was beautifully simple. People looked at a piece of meat left out in the sun, saw maggots appear, and thought, yep, that meat just gave birth to worms. Totally normal. No microscopes, no bacteria, no hand sanitizer, just vibes. Dangerous, disease-ridden vibes. In the pre-microscopic world, if something went wrong with your body, like you suddenly couldn't breathe, or your skin turned purple and fell off, it was either the will of the gods, a particularly moody demon, or the result of being born under the wrong star sign. Medical science, such as it existed, was less about what was actually happening inside your body, and more about what someone imagined might be happening, possibly while consulting a sheep liver, or smelling your breath. For thousands of years, people believed in the humoral theory, which sounds like something involving laughter, but was actually the most complicated excuse for not washing your hands. Invented by ancient Greek thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen, the theory claimed your body was made up of 4 essential fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Being healthy meant keeping them perfectly balanced. Being sick meant one of them had gone rogue. If you were too angry, you had too much yellow bile. If you were sad, blame black bile. If you were just feeling very mucousy, well, phlegm was having a party. The cure for all this? Bloodletting, leeching, or something involving hot compresses and a bucket. Basically medieval medicine boiled down to, you're feeling weak? Let's remove some of your blood. That'll help. And while we're at it, take a note here. Not one of these theories involved anything remotely resembling a germ. No bacteria, no viruses, just the vague notion that your spleen might be feeling a little dramatic today. Perhaps the most persistent idea before microscopes arrived was the miasma theory, the belief that diseases were caused by bad air, not bad, like your uncle's cooking after taco night, but foul-smelling, swampy corruption in the air bad. If you got sick in a city, people didn't look at your dirty water or your rotting food. They blamed the vibe of the air. Doctors during the Black Death in the 14th century genuinely believed that plague was spreading through invisible toxic gas clouds. So they did what any sensible professional would do. They wore long robes and terrifying bird-like masks, stuffed with herbs, flowers, and vinegar-soaked sponges. Because apparently, if you couldn't smell death, it couldn't touch you. Spoiler, it touched you anyway. A lot. The miasma theory was so sticky, it survived well into the 1800s. That's right, people were inventing steam engines and railroads while still believing that air itself was a malevolent force. Meanwhile, germs were just vibing unseen, throwing microscopic raves on doorknobs and in teacups. Beyond bad air and rogue body juices, a lot of people just blamed magic, or witches, or a curse, brought on by looking at a toad the wrong way. If your crops failed, and your nose started bleeding, it was probably because old widow Agnes glared at you during the solstice. Time to burn her house down, just in case. Diseases like epilepsy were thought to be divine punishment or demonic possession, and if someone had the plague, best to leave them in their house, nail the door shut, and walk away whistling. Medieval quarantine was less stay home and isolate, and more everyone throws rocks at you while hoping you die quietly. Medical knowledge was passed down through manuscripts filled with pictures of people urinating into vases, while a monk judged the colour. Urine charts were all the rage. A nice golden hue meant your humours were in sync. Greenish? Better get ready for some leeches. The one upside of this germ-free worldview. Ignorance really was bliss. People didn't scrub their hands obsessively. They drank from shared cups, snuggled goats, and walked barefoot through markets without a second thought. Because as far as they knew, disease wasn't hiding in your water, your bread, or your barber's unwashed fingers. It was the gods, or your aura, or maybe just fate. But all of that was about to change, because soon someone would pick up a tiny lens, peer into the unknown, and discover that water, sweet, innocent water, was basically a living zoo. It would shake the foundations of medicine, hygiene, and soup consumption forever. If your leg turned black and fell off, it was either a demon or Tuesday. Long before microscopes made us question whether we should drink anything that isn't boiling hot, it all started with something far simpler, a piece of glass. Not the high-tech stuff in your phone or your double-paned living room window, but the humble beginnings of optical glass, crafted by artisans who were more concerned with blowing elegant goblets than changing the course of human understanding. These early glassmakers weren't trying to peer into the microbial underworld. They were just trying not to set their hair on fire while melting sand. The art of glass blowing traces back thousands of years, but it wasn't until the Middle Ages and Renaissance that things started to get unintentionally scientific. In bustling workshops from Venice to Germany, skilled craftsmen learned to manipulate molten silica into delicate vessels, panes, and beads. Occasionally, someone would notice that a slightly rounded shard of glass made things look bigger. Letters seemed to swell. Ants looked enormous, and suddenly, the humble glassblower was sitting on a game-changer. Eyeglasses, for example, came into being around the late 13th century, invented by some now-forgotten genius, probably after squinting too hard at a Bible. The first spectacles were little more than polished convex lenses held in front of the eyes. No temples, no hinges, just two magnifying circles stuck together like a science project at a monastery. Monks and scholars adored them. Finally, you didn't have to choose between a life of religious devotion and going blind by 30. These early lenses didn't just help with reading, they helped build reputations. Being the guy who wore spectacles gave you the aura of wisdom, literacy, and possibly access to secret ancient knowledge. Spectacles became the medieval equivalent of nerd street cred. If you had glasses, people assumed you were either translating Aristotle or summoning demons with Latin footnotes. The invention of the magnifying glass soon followed, or maybe it came first. Historical records are fuzzy, because again, no one at the time realized they were on the verge of inventing the device that would one day ruin people's relationship with leftover stew. But by the 14th century, magnifying glasses were becoming more than just a curiosity. Jewelers used them to inspect their wares, scribes used them to check for spelling errors, or maybe to double their hourly rate, and the curious began to point them at whatever seemed interesting, including dead insects, fabric fibers, and occasionally their own skin, which was a mistake they wouldn't make twice. These lenses weren't precise by today's standards. They were bubbly, warped, and occasionally turned your subject into a shimmering blob. But they worked, at least enough to start teasing humanity with the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was more to the world than what your eyeballs could detect, unaided. The most thrilling use of these lenses, if you're the kind of person who thrills easily, was bug watching. Not metaphorical bugs, mind you, actual ones. With the naked eye, an ant is just a fast-moving comma with legs, but through a magnifying lens, it becomes an armored nightmare, with jaws and attitude. Early observers must have felt like they'd discovered alien life forms living on their windowsills. Some even began drawing what they saw, giving us some of the earliest proto-scientific illustrations of nature's smaller creatures, each one looking more like something from a horror movie storyboard than a biology lesson. And let's not forget how deeply confusing this all was. People saw these creatures up close and personal for the first time, and didn't know what to think. Were they magical? Did they have tiny souls? Did they work for demons? These weren't questions asked lightly in an age when the boundary between science and witchcraft was thinner than a wine glass. Observing fleas under a lens was as likely to get you burned at the stake as it was to get you published. But despite the confusion, the groundwork had been laid. Glassblowers had made the lenses, scholars had peered through them, and somewhere, someone with too much time and too many beetles started wondering what else this magnification magic could reveal. The stage was set. The microscope was next, and with it would come the horrifying revelation that nothing was clean ever again. By the early 1600s, humanity had already discovered that glass could make small things look bigger, but it still hadn't quite connected that some of those small things were actively living on your face. That horrifying epiphany would come courtesy of a gadget that seemed innocent enough. A tube with a few pieces of curved glass inside. But once people started pointing that tube at things like water, mold, or anything that had once been alive, well, it was all downhill for ignorance. The microscope had arrived, and it brought along a fresh batch of nightmares. Credit for the first true compound microscope, that is, a microscope with multiple lenses working together, generally goes to a Dutch father-son duo, Hans and Zacharias Janssen, spectacle makers by trade. The story goes that sometime around 1590, the Jansens were tinkering around with lenses, possibly trying to make the world's most impractical telescope, when they accidentally created something that made tiny things look less tiny. The microscope was born in a spectacle shop, possibly by accident, definitely without safety instructions, and absolutely without any idea of the chaos it would unleash on water bowls and soup. The Jansens' invention wasn't exactly the high-tech marvel you'd find in a modern lab. It was clunky, blurry, and sometimes made you feel like you were staring at fog through a soda straw. Still, it worked. You could now see things that were previously invisible, which at the time was the closest humanity had come to actual sorcery without summoning a goat. But the microscope as a tool really took off, thanks to a man named Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who had zero formal scientific education and 100% unshakable obsession, a Dutch draper by profession. Yes, he sold cloth for a living. Leeuwenhoek wasn't trying to revolutionize biology, he just wanted to see fabric threads in more detail. So he started making his own lenses, tiny curved slivers of glass, that turned out to be better than anything his contemporaries were using. Like way better. His microscopes could magnify up to 300 times, which meant Leeuwenhoek was now peering into a world that literally no human had ever seen before. And what did he choose to examine first? Everything. And we mean everything. Drops of pond water, flecks of dental plaque, rainwater from rooftops, scrapings from his own tongue. Even, brace yourself, water from his own wash basin. Leeuwenhoek was on a mission, and that mission was apparently to ruin the very concept of cleanliness for generations to come. Through his handcrafted microscopes, he discovered what he called animalcules, tiny wriggling swimming creatures that seemed to come out of nowhere. He watched them dart, spiral, and bounce around like microscopic maniacs in a nightclub. And this wasn't some vague description in a dusty notebook. He documented everything in painfully detailed letters to the Royal Society in London, who were both impressed and mildly traumatized. He saw bacteria, not that anyone called them that yet, protozoa, sperm cells, blood cells, and yeast, among other tiny horrors. His discovery that semen was filled with swimming creatures sparked endless debates, most of which involved grown men arguing about whether sperm had tiny humans inside them. It was the 17th century version of internet comment wars. But let's talk about pond water, the real MVP of Leeuwenhoek's discovery tour. Up until this point, most people thought water was just water, sometimes clear, sometimes murky, but always inert, harmless. Definitely not a wiggling, pulsing soup of life. Leeuwenhoek shattered that illusion with one peek through his lens. In a single drop of water, he found a bustling ecosystem of what he called very little animals, which is the polite way of saying your drinking water is throwing a rave. This was the moment when the microscope stopped being a fun novelty and started being a paradigm shift. For the first time in human history, people realized there was an entire invisible world layered over everything they knew. Water, food, even you. Nothing was solid and stable anymore. Everything was moving under the surface. People didn't just gain knowledge, they gained paranoia. And yet Van Leeuwenhoek wasn't even trying to be a hero of science. He kept his lens-making technique, a secret classic inventor move, wrote in a hard-to-read regional Dutch dialect, and never called himself a scientist. But by simply pointing a better microscope at the gross stuff around him, he laid the foundation for microbiology, sanitation reform, disease research, and the decision to never drink straight from a river again. There are moments in history that shatter reality: the invention of the wheel, the discovery of electricity, and the day someone realized that a drop of water wasn't just water, it was alive. Not metaphorically alive, not full of life, in a poetic sense. No, actually teeming with real, squirming creatures, most of which looked like they had no business being anywhere near your drinking cup. After Anthony van Leeuwenhoek pointed his tiny, high-powered lenses at pretty much everything gross and damp, humanity found itself having an existential crisis. It didn't even know it had scheduled. Until then, people assumed that small things like dirt or scum were just lifeless stuff. If your wine turned sour, it was because Bacchus was in a mood, not because invisible blobs were throwing a bacterial house party inside the barrel. But now, thanks to the microscope, scientists and curious onlookers alike were coming face to face with microscopic life for the first time. Bacteria, protozoa, sperm cells, and other tiny stowaways previously undetectable to the naked eye, and the reactions ranged from awe to full-blown revulsion. Because let's face it, nothing kills your appetite like realizing your glass of water looks like the set of Finding Nemo. If all the characters were shaped like angry commas and moved like they were late for something, Leeuwenhoek had discovered sperm cells by examining, brace yourself, his own semen. That's dedication, or possibly madness. Either way, what he saw were tiny, wriggling swimmers, each one zooming around like it had somewhere extremely important to be. The implications were explosive. Suddenly, reproduction wasn't just a mysterious biological miracle, it was a literal microscopic relay race. But it wasn't just sperm that caused a stir. His descriptions of pond water revealed protozoa, amoeba-like organisms swimming, spinning, and stretching their way through a watery universe. Scientists didn't even have the vocabulary yet. Some referred to them as animalcules, which sounds cute until you realize they're crawling over your lettuce. Others simply called them beasties, which somehow feels worse. But the term that would stick and forever change our understanding of disease was bacteria. These bacteria were everywhere, on surfaces, in mouths, in water, probably on the microscope itself. Leeuwenhoek even took a peek at the plaque from his own teeth, as one does when gifted with a wildly powerful microscope and no fear of dental hygiene, and found a forest of living organisms. He then examined the plaque of someone who didn't brush their teeth, and let's just say he never looked at his friends the same way again. The broader scientific community took all this in with a mixture of excitement and horror. Some were skeptical, others were enchanted, but more than a few scientists and physicians realized that this changed everything. For centuries, doctors had relied on theories like humours and miasmas to explain sickness. Now they were being told that tiny invisible creatures might be the real culprits behind disease. That was the equivalent of finding out your childhood teddy bear had been plotting your downfall in secret. And as more microscopes spread across Europe, more scientists began to see what Leeuwenhoek saw. Blood wasn't just red goo, it had structure, cells, patterns, repetition. People weren't just breathing air. They were inhaling entire ecosystems. Even rotting food, which had once been dismissed as a product of spontaneous generation, was now crawling with microscopic life forms that had been there all along. They didn't appear from nowhere. They multiplied, they moved, they thrived. Of course, not everyone was ready to accept this. Some clung desperately to old beliefs. Germ theory wouldn't become fully accepted until the 19th century, long after Leeuwenhoek was dead and buried, and presumably decomposing in a way he'd have found scientifically fascinating. But the seed was planted, the microscope had cracked open the invisible world, and there was no stuffing the bacteria back in the petri dish. And let's not ignore the general public's reaction. As news of these invisible creatures spread, people began to see the world differently. That glass of milk? Suspicious. Your neighbor's breath? Probably toxic. People started boiling water, scrubbing hands, and side-eyeing their leftovers with a newfound intensity. This wasn't just a scientific discovery, it was the birth of microscopic paranoia. Because now, even a morning routine was a microbial battlefield. You drank a glass of water, He saw 500 tiny creatures reenacting a rave. Breakfast would never be the same again. Before microscopes showed up, medicine was like trying to fix a car by poking it with a stick and praying. Got a fever? Bleed them. Coughing up blood? Time for more bleeding. Maybe with leeches, if you're feeling fancy. Doctors had their hearts in the right place. But unfortunately, not much else. Diagnoses were based on guesswork, superstition, and occasionally, whether Mercury was in retrograde. Then came the microscope, and suddenly, medicine stopped being astrology with extra blood and started becoming science. The moment scientists began pointing lenses at human tissue, it was clear that the body wasn't just a squishy bag of emotions and fluids. It was an intricately organized machine, a horrifying, pulsating machine, full of cells, vessels, and microscopic drama. With early microscopes, researchers could finally see red blood cells circulating like tiny life rafts, white blood cells attacking invaders like microscopic bouncers, and tissue fibers weaving through organs like spaghetti. It wasn't just enlightening, it was revolutionary. One of the first major shifts microscopes caused was in anatomy and pathology. Previously, understanding disease meant dissecting corpses, guessing which bits looked off, and hoping nobody sneezed during the process. Now, pathologists could place tissue samples under a microscope and witness firsthand the structural changes caused by disease. Cells misshaped, nuclei swelling, bacteria invading like microscopic pirates. Suddenly, there were clues, patterns, visual evidence. It was no longer, this man died of imbalance. It became, this man died because his lungs were filled with bacterial squatters. This clarity also helped dismantle one of the longest-running scientific myths of all time, spontaneous generation. The delightful belief that life could just poof into existence from non-life. Leave out meat, maggots will just appear. Set some broth on the windowsill. Bam, life. For centuries, people accepted that rot magically birthed bugs. But then, with the microscope's help, scientists like Francesco Redi and Louis Pasteur stepped in and ruined the party. Redi's experiments in the 17th century, like covering meat with gauze to prevent flies from laying eggs, were the early cracks in the spontaneous generation wall. But it was Pasteur in the 19th century who kicked that wall down, stomped on the rubble, and yelled, "It's the microbes, stupid!" Using carefully sealed flasks and microscopes to detect microbial activity, Pasteur proved that microorganisms came from contamination, not from the meat itself developing sentience and deciding to grow worms. Spontaneous generation was toast, and humanity finally accepted that. No, life doesn't just emerge from yesterday's soup, but microscopes didn't just help destroy bad ideas, they built new ones, the most important being germ theory. For the first time, disease wasn't some vague curse floating on a foul breeze. It was the direct result of tiny organisms, germs invading the body. This changed everything. Doctors stopped blaming bad air and dirty thoughts, and started focusing on actual sources of infection. Unwashed hands, contaminated tools, and the guy sneezing directly into your wound. This new theory gained steam thanks to scientists like Robert Koch, who identified the specific bacteria behind diseases like anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. With a microscope, he could isolate the pathogen, culture it, and prove it caused the disease. It was like Sherlock Holmes solving microscopic murder cases. Suddenly, medicine had a villain to point at, and a strategy for fighting back. Microscopes also led to the rise of antiseptics and sterilization. If germs were real, and they clearly were, then keeping things clean wasn't just a good habit. It was the line between life and death. Enter Joseph Lister, who used carbolic acid to sterilize surgical tools and wounds. Death rates plummeted. People were shocked. You mean if I don't saw off this leg with a bloody rusty hacksaw, the patient might live? Yes indeed. Hospitals slowly stopped resembling crime scenes and started becoming the clean, white lab-coated institutions we recognize today. Surgeons washed their hands, nurses boiled their instruments, and doctors, for once, weren't the leading cause of death in the room. Microscopes even made diagnosis less of an interpretive dance and more of a science. Lab technicians could now examine blood samples, tissue slides, and sputum smears to identify illnesses without relying on guesswork or chicken entrails. Disease became visible, measurable, and most importantly, treatable. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. The realization that the world was teeming with disease-causing life forms sent some people spiraling into full-blown paranoia. Suddenly, every doorknob was a potential death trap, every handshake a microbial handshake of doom. But fear also brought progress. Sanitation laws were passed. Clean water systems were developed. People started boiling their milk, and not just because it tasted weird. The microscope had done its job. It didn't just change medicine, it launched it into a new era, one where illness had names, faces, and biological fingerprints. And most importantly, it helped doctors finally realize the cold, hard truth. The microscope didn't just change science, it changed people. In fact, you could say it did too good of a job. Once scientists cracked open the microbial world and confirmed that bacteria were real, wriggling, invisible goblins, responsible for everything from the common cold to catastrophic plagues, humanity collectively went, "Wait, they're everywhere," and just like that, the age of enlightenment gave way to the age of bleach. Before germ theory, a little dirt was just dirt. You washed your hands when they were visibly caked in mud, or you'd just slaughtered a goat, and even then, maybe just a quick splash if someone important was watching. But now, dirt was suspicious. Water was suspicious. You were suspicious, because once you knew that these microscopic invaders were living on door handles, in bedsheets, on your fork, and possibly plotting to overthrow your immune system at breakfast, you couldn't unknow it. Cue the rise of disinfection, sterilization, and compulsive cleanliness. Hospitals, newly aware that they had unintentionally doubled as germ farms, scrambled to disinfect everything. Instruments were boiled, surgeons started wearing gloves, linens were scalded within an inch of their fibrous lives. Even your average home began to look less like a cozy dwelling, and more like a low-budget chemistry lab. Soap sales soared, vinegar became a weapon, and suddenly, grandmothers everywhere had scientific justification for scrubbing the same countertop 17 times in a row. Hand-washing in particular went from afterthought to obsession. Doctors like Ignaz Semmelweis had tried, and failed, to convince physicians to wash their hands earlier in the century. They laughed him out of the room, literally. But now, with microscopes showing those hands were covered in bustling colonies of bacterial squatters, nobody was laughing. Hand-washing became mandatory. If you didn't lather up before a surgery, delivering a baby, or heaven forbid, touching a sandwich, you weren't just unhygienic, you were a public menace. Then came the public health campaigns. Governments realized that it wasn't enough for doctors to be clean. Everyone had to get on board. Posters were plastered in schools, train stations and outhouses urging people to wash their hands, boil their water, and stop letting their livestock sleep in the kitchen. In some cities, public spitting was outlawed. In others, health inspectors had the power to shut down restaurants that didn't meet new sterilization standards. The war on germs had gone mainstream. Of course, not all of these campaigns were perfectly calibrated. Some leaned hard into full-blown fear-mongering. Germs became the boogeyman of the modern world. The enemy you couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't run from, but that could allegedly kill you in your sleep if you forgot to scrub under your fingernails. Soap companies pounced on the panic, selling their products as the only defense against microbial doom. Cleanliness is next to godliness went from a religious platitude to a bacterial battle cry. Soon, cleaning rituals began to bleed into daily life in strange ways. People started bathing more, but not necessarily for comfort. It was about decontamination. Mothers began boiling baby bottles, toys, and pacifiers like they were prepping for a NASA launch. And if the child happened to drop said pacifier, burn it and buy another. Some even began ironing underwear. Yes, ironing underwear, just in case the washing machine missed a pathogen. The obsession spread to architecture and design too. Public buildings started incorporating tiles, stainless steel, and easily cleanable surfaces. Kitchens were rearranged to reduce the chances of cross-contamination. Windows got bigger to let in healthier light, and public spaces banned heavy curtains and carpets, which were now seen as luxurious germ hotels. At the same time, a more subtle transformation was happening. Germ etiquette. Sneezing into your elbow, coughing away from people, not licking public statues, all became part of a new, invisible code of conduct. Microbial awareness wasn't just a medical revolution, it was a social one. But of course, Paranoia has a way of mutating. Some people became germaphobes before the word even existed. Wealthier families would hire hygiene consultants to inspect their homes for bacterial hotspots. Others went full DIY scientist, obsessively boiling everything from vegetables to doorknobs. And if you so much as mention drinking from a communal water fountain, prepare for judgmental stares and a speech about amoebic dysentery. Still, as extreme as some of the responses were, the new age of hygiene had measurable benefits. Disease rates plummeted in areas that embraced sterilization. Infant mortality dropped. Surgeries stopped resembling medieval trials. In short, paranoia worked. Unnerving, absolutely, but effective. The microscope had opened our eyes, not just to bacteria, but to the terrifying truth that ignorance had been our only form of peace. We now lived in a world where everything had the potential to kill us, and that awareness would forever shape how we ate, bathed, loved, and lived. Once microscopes helped doctors stop treating disease with leeches and guesswork, it was only a matter of time before someone said, "You know what kids need, a close-up look at pond scum." And just like that, the microscope marched its way out of the lab and into the classroom, where it would go on to shatter youthful illusions, destroy many a sandwich, and traumatize several generations of students who just wanted a quiet nap in biology. But before microscopes invaded schools, they had a slightly more charming phase, the Victorian parlor microscope era. Yes, long before TikTok, the 19th century pastime of choice for bored aristocrats was peering into the lives of bugs and calling it science. Parlor microscopes were beautifully crafted devices, often made of brass and wood, and they sat proudly in the drawing rooms of well-off families, right next to the piano, and that one fern nobody could keep alive. Victorian ladies would gather after tea to examine prepared slides of insect wings, flower pollen, and occasionally, horrifyingly magnified lice. Gentlemen, meanwhile, would write detailed, overly dramatic journal entries about the terrible elegance of the flea or the sublime rot of old cheese. It was all very proper, very dignified, and just slightly gross. As science began democratizing in the late 1800s and early 1900s, microscopes started slipping into classrooms, much to the horror of unsuspecting school children. Teachers, excited to offer hands-on learning, began handing out glass slides and tweezers like Oprah giving away prizes. You get a slide, you get a dead fly. Everyone gets to magnify something they'll never unsee. One of the first classic microscope rites of passage, the onion cell slide. It sounds innocent enough. Just a thin layer of onion skin, stained with iodine and viewed under magnification. But to a kid expecting something cool, like a dragon cell or maybe glowing plasma, seeing a sheet of boring rectangles is anticlimactic. That is, until they realize that they are also made of tiny rectangles. Identity crisis initiated, and then came the mold slide. At some point, every science teacher thought it was a brilliant idea to grow mold on bread, let it fester in a petri dish for a week, and then let the entire class take a peek. From the outside, it looked like a fuzzy patch of green. Under the microscope, it looked like the villain from a sci-fi horror movie. Spiky tendrils, spore pods, a thriving alien metropolis. One minute you're reaching for toast, the next you're wondering if it's plotting to take over your digestive system. If the mold didn't do it, frog dissection surely finished the job. While technically not under a microscope, at first frog guts became a gateway drug for slide analysis. One by one, kids learned how to peel back layers, identify organs, and question why they ever trusted their lunch lady. Some brave souls even attempted to view frog blood or liver cells under magnification. The result? A newfound respect for amphibians, and a deep-seated fear of biology labs. Let's not forget the classroom microscopes themselves, usually donated by a school board that hadn't updated equipment since the 1950s. These machines were bulky, slightly dented, and smelled vaguely of dust and disappointment. Their light sources rarely worked. The focusing knobs were either broken or too enthusiastic, and getting your eye to align with the eyepiece required the flexibility of a gymnast and the patience of a monk. Yet, despite the trauma, the smell of preservatives, and the one kid who always dropped a slide, there was something magical about seeing the invisible. Microscopes turned everyday things into alien worlds. A feather became a fractal forest, a hair looked like a coiled cable, even a smear of yogurt, don't ask, revealed a swirling metropolis of bacteria having the time of their lives. And for some, those weird moments stuck. The blurry joy of discovering something small and alive sparked curiosity. It created young scientists, microbiologists, pathologists, forensic experts. Many trace their careers back to that one time in 7th grade, when they accidentally saw a dust mite and screamed internally for 10 minutes. Microscopes in school weren't just about education. They were initiation rituals into the uncomfortable truth that the world is more alive, more chaotic, and much grosser than we'd like to believe. They forced students to confront the invisible, to reckon with the fact that their sandwich bread, gym socks, and even their own spit were all teeming with life. Just when you thought it was safe to look at your skin again, humanity went and gave microscopes superpowers. The traditional light microscope had already pulled back the curtain on bacteria, blood cells, and a few unfortunate lunches, but there was a limit, a hard physical line in the sand, because light, as it turns out, can only bend so far. If you wanted to see things smaller than about 200 nanometers, that's 0.0002 millimeters. For those keeping track, you'd need more than a lens. You'd need a revolution. And in the 1930s, that revolution came screaming in on a beam of electrons. Enter the electron microscope, a terrifying buzzing contraption that doesn't use light at all. Instead, it fires a stream of electrons at your sample like a sci-fi weapon of precision. Electrons have a much smaller wavelength than light, which means they can reveal details so tiny you could see things your nightmares haven't even imagined yet. If the light microscope showed us germs, the electron microscope showed us what the germs had for breakfast. Invented in Germany by physicist Ernst Rüsker and electrical engineer Max Knoll in 1931, the first transmission electron microscope, TEM, was a clunky but mind-blowing machine that used magnetic lenses to focus electrons and create images with jaw-dropping resolution. For the first time, scientists could look deep inside cells and see organelles, not just the blobs described by earlier microscopes, but structures within structures. It was like discovering your house was actually made of tiny Legos that all had their own plumbing. And then came the scanning electron microscope, SEM, in the 1960s, which added a third dimension to the horror. SEM doesn't just show you through something, it lets you look at something in glorious, terrifying 3D. Suddenly, everyone from entomologists to crime scene investigators were gazing into the microscopic world with the clarity of an IMAX documentary directed by a horror filmmaker. Because, let's talk about what these microscopes actually revealed: insects' faces. For starters, you might have thought ants were cute, or at least harmless. Then an electron microscope came along and said, actually, here's your six-legged friend with compound eyes the size of stadiums, and a mouth that looks like it wants to unhinge and swallow your soul. Lice, mites, fleas, and mosquitoes. They all went from minor annoyances to cosmic horrors that looked like they should be boarding ships in a Ridley Scott movie. But the terror wasn't just skin deep. Electron microscopes let us see viruses for the first time. Those minuscule biological landmines that are smaller than even most bacteria. Polio, influenza, herpes, HIV, all of them were suddenly visible in detail, so crisp you could almost hear them plotting. Virologists no longer had to guess what a virus looked like based on symptoms and educated guesses. They could see the viral invader in action, bursting out of cells like a microscopic alien invasion. And then there was DNA. For centuries, scientists had theorized what the molecule of heredity looked like, but now they could capture images of its famous double helix structure. It was the molecular equivalent of unmasking the puppet master of life itself. Biologists could observe how DNA curled, twisted, duplicated, and occasionally made catastrophic typos that led to mutations, diseases, or an extra toe. Electron microscopes didn't just stop at biology, they crashed headfirst into materials science and nanotechnology, opening entirely new worlds of discovery. Engineers started looking at metal alloys on the atomic level. Chemists began observing reactions between individual atoms. People even figured out how to build nanostructures, machines so small they could, in theory, travel through your bloodstream and fix a single broken cell. You know, casually inventing things that used to exist only in superhero movies. Even today, electron microscopes are the spy satellites of science. They let researchers inspect semiconductor chips to the atom, examine ancient fossils without destroying them, and analyze particles in space dust collected by probes. They're used in crime labs to identify microscopic traces of paint or gunpowder. They're even used to authenticate paintings, because a centuries-old brushstroke under magnification tells no lies. The only downside, the emotionally scarring visuals. If you've ever seen a housefly's eye up close, you know what we're talking about. If you haven't, well, imagine thousands of tiny lenses staring directly into your soul while whispering, "I've seen things." These are the images that haunt PowerPoint slides and permanently erase your ability to touch moss, feathers, or chocolate without wondering what's living inside. Still, with great resolution comes great responsibility. The electron microscope didn't just advance science. It changed the scale of what we considered observable. It redefined small. It revealed the architecture of life itself and handed humanity the magnifying glass to peer into the machinery of reality. By the time microscopes were done terrorizing bread, transforming medicine, and zooming in on every molecule like a nosy neighbor with a telescope, they found their next great calling, fighting crime. And just like that, the world's smallest detectives joined the law enforcement team, not with badges or guns, but with slides, stains, and the unnerving ability to catch a killer from one stray hair. Welcome to the world of forensic microscopy, where even a single fiber, speck of dirt, or lonely eyelash can be the difference between freedom and a lifetime of regretting your tattoo choices in prison. Crime scenes are messy, chaotic, often designed to mislead, but under a microscope, they start singing like a canary. Let's start with fibers and hairs, the low-hanging fruit of forensic evidence. At a glance, two black cotton fibers look identical. Under a microscope, they might be completely different weave patterns, different dye compositions, or covered in different residues, like gunshot particles, or your favorite brand of deodorant. Criminals used to think a good scrub and a hoodie were enough to erase their presence. But the microscope doesn't care about your hoodie. It's too busy analyzing the diameter of the hair you left behind and matching it to your follicles, like a creepy, highly accurate hairstylist. Pollen is another weird MVP of crime solving. Known as palynology, this microscopic science can tell investigators where someone's been based on the plant dust they've unknowingly carried around. A corpse found in the city but covered in pollen from alpine meadows. Suspicious. A suspect's clothes dusted with pollen found only near the crime scene. Busted. Plants are basically snitches with no loyalty. Blood takes center stage too, but not in the dramatic. There's blood everywhere. TV sense. We're talking blood smears, cell damage, trace splatters invisible to the naked eye. A microscope can confirm whether that tiny brown flake is dirt or dried blood. And if it's blood, is it human? Is it consistent with a struggle? Is it mixed with another person's? Suddenly, the whole narrative changes. Then there's gunshot residue. Every time a firearm is discharged, it releases microscopic particles of lead, barium, and antimony. These residues settle on the shooter's hands, clothing, and sometimes their face, basically anywhere the laws of physics feel like causing trouble. Scanning electron microscopes, SAM, are particularly handy here, detecting those telltale metallic crumbs like glitter from a very violent party. You might have ditched the weapon and washed your hands, but if that residue is still in the folds of your jacket, you're toast. But forensic microscopy isn't just useful in modern crime. It's also been a game-changer in archaeology and historical investigations, proving that even ancient mysteries can be cracked by tiny clues. Take the famous King Tutankhamun autopsy. While the boy pharaoh's body had been mummified and slightly overcooked by ancient embalming chemicals, microscopy helped identify the presence of broken bones, possible infections, and the unsettling fact that his chest was missing entirely. Fun, in another case, Otzi the Iceman, a 5,000-year-old frozen corpse found in the Alps, got his own microscopic VIP treatment. Scientists found blood cells in his wounds, still intact, along with traces of moss, grain, and ancient pollen in his stomach, painting a surprisingly vivid picture of his final hours. The guy was likely murdered after eating a hearty grain-based meal. Killer carbs, indeed. In modern forensics, paint chips are another goldmine. Two red cars may look the same, but under a microscope, their paint layers, primer, base coat, clear coat, reveal a fingerprint of their own. Add some glass fragments, soil particles, or cosmetic residues, and you've got enough evidence to build a whole Netflix docuseries. And the magic doesn't stop at solving crimes. Microscopes also help prevent them. In customs and border control, they're used to verify whether materials like ivory, furs, or exotic woods are the real deal, or just clever knockoffs. In art forgery, they expose modern brushstrokes on supposedly ancient paintings, and in counter-terrorism, they detect explosive residues so fine they make powdered sugar look chunky. All this, thanks to a machine that lets us look closely, really closely, at the world's messiest situations. It's not about what you see with your eyes, it's about what you miss until you zoom in 1,000 times and realize the killer left a microscopic trail of betrayal behind. If the early microscope was like opening a portal to a new world, then today's microscopes are more like installing surveillance cameras in the fabric of reality itself. What began as squinting at pond scum has evolved into seeing living cells in real time, guiding cancer treatments with surgical precision, and even designing robots that are smaller than a speck of glitter on a cat's nose. We've officially entered the age of microscopic wizardry, where peering into the unseen doesn't just satisfy curiosity, it can save your life. One of the most game-changing advances in modern microscopy is real-time cell imaging. We're not just looking at dead tissue on a slide anymore, we're watching living cells in action. Imagine observing a cancer cell trying to divide while a white blood cell closes in like a biological hitman, or tracking how a single protein travels across the membrane of a neuron. Researchers can now see how diseases spread as they're happening, offering up to the millisecond data that's transforming treatment. Speaking of which, cancer research has received a massive upgrade thanks to high-powered microscopes. With fluorescence microscopy, scientists can tag different cell parts with glowing dyes and track exactly where tumors are forming, how they grow, and which drugs are working or not. This means doctors aren't just throwing treatments at a wall and seeing what sticks, they're pinpointing where and how to strike. Targeted therapies, personalized medicine, and early detection are all possible because someone pointed a laser at a cell and said, "Let's see what this bad boy does under pressure." And then we enter the truly futuristic realm, nanotechnology. If traditional science deals with things you can hold in your hand, nanotech deals with things that can walk across a red blood cell and still have room to moonwalk. These microscopic machines, nanobots, are being engineered to swim through your bloodstream, hunt down cancer cells, deliver medicine to exactly the right spot, and maybe even perform minor repairs along the way. Forget sci-fi, this is happening now, and microscopes are the eyes guiding their every move. Researchers are already experimenting with DNA origami, folding strands of DNA like biological Legos to build nanostructures that can carry drugs, change shape, or even self-destruct on command. Need a molecular envelope that only opens in the presence of a tumor marker? There's a nanobot for that, and if that bot malfunctions, a high-powered microscope can find and fix the flaw before it ends up in the bloodstream doing something awkward, like mistaking a kidney cell for a criminal. It doesn't stop with medicine. AI-powered microscopes are now helping scientists detect patterns the human eye could never spot. Imagine feeding an AI thousands of microscopic images, cells, bacteria, tissue samples, and training it to recognize the tiniest hints of disease before a human even knows what to look for. It's like teaching a microscope to do diagnostics, and in some cases, it's already outperforming seasoned pathologists. Meanwhile, quantum microscopy is knocking on the door, using entangled photons and exotic physics to achieve resolutions once thought impossible. If that sentence gave you a headache, don't worry, just know that we're on the cusp of being able to image individual atoms in living systems. Yes, atoms. The things that make up molecules, that make up cells, that make up you. It's like zooming into a Zoom call that's happening inside your mitochondria. Even environmental science is cashing in. Modern microscopes are helping analyze microplastics, detect contaminants in drinking water, and track the smallest life forms in the most extreme environments, from deep-sea vents to Mars rock samples. Yes, Mars, because when humans finally find alien life, odds are the first witness will be a microscope saying, "Yep, it's ugly, but it's alive." Of course, with great magnification comes great existential dread. For every step forward, there's a tiny, squirming reminder that the world is more crowded, complex, and uncontrollable than we ever imagined. The same microscopes that help cure diseases also show us the billions of invisible things living on our phones, our pillows, and yes, our toothbrushes. Suddenly, dental hygiene feels like preparing for microbial war. But here's the beautiful irony. The closer we look, the more we realize how much we still don't know. Cells behave unexpectedly. Bacteria evolve in real time. Even now, the microscopic universe holds mysteries deeper than space. And yet, we keep building better lenses, sharper tools, and smarter AI to help us dive even deeper into this tiny, tangled jungle of life. Microscopes aren't just tools anymore. They're portals to discovery, scalpels of precision, and storytellers of the unseen. They let us read the fine print of existence, whether it's a cancer cell mutating, a nanobot fixing a clogged artery, or an alien microbe waving hello from a Martian rock. We've gone from squinting at pond water to designing robots smaller than your dandruff. And that's the microscopic journey, from ancient spectacle makers to nanotech dreamers. The microscope didn't just change science, it rewired the way we see life itself. And just think, it all started because someone looked at a drop of water and asked, what if it's not just water?